Islam, Islam nobles. I am Menelik Allah Rahim Brown L, and I'm coming today about again about the Moorish Science Temple of America, the FBI files, and I just want to make sure that I get across to the people um that they get a bright understanding, overstanding about the situation at hand. Now, I want to start off with the holy prayer. Allah is the Father of the universe. Allah is the Father of love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice. Allah is my God, my protection by night and by day through His illustrious holy prophet, Noble Drew Ali, Ameen, in Islam. Now, I want to get into the girth of how propaganda been spread, and now that we are in this day and age and this point in time, that we have a history of what has been going on as far as the temples, the FBI, and how they were made to antagonize and attack Moors for standing on love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice, and standing on their rights as far as being a Moorish American, um, Muslim, national. And it's a lot of trickery that, you know, that has taken place as far as the principles and as far as civics and as far as vanguarding those protections that is accredited and bestowed upon the unalienable and inalienable rights of the Moorish American Muslims. Now, I want to get into what I left off from yesterday, and it was coming from this standpoint as far as the industrialization and immigration. Okay, the intersection of religion with the process of industrialization and immigration that would reshape America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries also influenced the Bureau's approach to religion. The sequence of events that marked the transition from the age of Reconstruction to the age of big business, the Depression of 1873, the breakdown of radical Reconstruction, and the corrupt compromise that ushered Rutherford B. Hayes into office in 1877 turned the focus of the federal government away from enforcing civil rights toward protecting businesses and free enterprise. The growing conflict between labor and capital and rapid immigration from Europe threatened or were seen to threaten the nation's domestic security and economic well being. The changes also had a major impact on religious life as the nation's white Protestant establishment, already feeling menaced by more autonomous Moorish Americans, also felt threatened by Catholic immigrants because, you know, within the Naturalization Act, you know, they took upon to just be white themselves and not pay homage to the Moors. So, the Bureau emerged in an age of economic conflict that also had a sectarian dimension, and its role was to protect a certain conception of the socialist order. This was the so-called Gilded Age of American history, during which a veneer of prosperity masked profound social inequality and unrest, advantaged by the support or at least the blind eye of the government. The new captains of industry, railroad magnates, steel and oil barons, real estate and retail titans amassed capital with abandon, while the laboring classes saw no such gains. Journalists and authors armed with new flash photograph photography brought the disparity to the broader public. Jacobs Rise articles, which later culminated in the publication of How the Order, How the Other Half Lives, Studies Among the Tenements of New York, 1890, vividly described the wretched conditions of tenement housings, the lack of sewage and garbage collection that plagued workers' surroundings, and the sweatshop conditions and paltry wages of workers and laboring children. The disparities between the haves and have-nots reached unprecedented levels, as overwhelming poverty and blatant disparity pushed some to the brink of violence, and struggle between labor and capital was fought in the streets. But it also played out in debates which within the church as violent confrontations between striking workers, law enforcement, and armed militias became more common. Catholics and Protestants alike wrestled with what their faith had to say about the blessings and ravages of industrial capitalism, and advocates of both labor and capital sought religious support for their respective stances. Thus, for example, reformers such as Nanny Helen Burroughs, Reverdy Ransom, Jane Etna Hunter, Henry Hughes Proctor, Walter Raschenbusch, and Washington Gladden called on the church to respond to the needs of the working classes. Faith communities, they contended, needed to aggressively engage labor and the poor, even as secular society needed to be Christianized. To put Christianity into practice, they argued, was to support labor unions and their collective demands, such as the 8-hour workday and child labor laws. Opponents, however, such as the Reverend David Swing, vehemently disagreed with these social gossipers, as they became known. The conflict between classes in the cities of our country is not a conflict between labor and capital. Sewin argued in an 1874 editorial, but between successful and unsuccessful lives, in other words, poverty and the social unrest that threatened to tear society apart, were the result of individual moral failure, not industrial capitalism. Other opponents went further, seeing the social gospel and its advocacy for workers and labor reform as radical socialist inspired takeovers of the church and the nation under the guise of social Christianity. Collective bargaining, they argued, was unchristian at best, socialism and anarchy at worst. The influx of immigrants from Europe, modern Europeans or Yabos, and Asia only compounded concerns about the growing chasm between the classes. And it also added another religious dimension to the extent that many of these immigrants were not Protestant. Immigrants not only threatened the economic security of those already in America, but also brought with them Catholicism, atheism, and other creeds. Um, and antithetical to the belief system of Protestants. One person who held this attitude was Hosea Strong, a Protestant minister and social gospel proponent who cast immigration and its religious effects as a crisis for American identity and security. He famously warned about the perils threatening our country in his 1885 book of the same name, Immigration. Roman Catholicism, which he saw as connected to the immigration issue, Catholic and secular influences in the public schools, Mormonism, intemperance, which he also largely blamed on immigrants, socialism, materialism, and rapid urbanization, again, traceable to immigration, strong, articulate, and anxiety and sense of siege felt by many Americans who identify as Anglo Saxons. Immigration is detrimental to popular morals, he warned, and has a like influence upon popular intelligence. Immigration complicates our moral and political problems by swelling our dangerous classes. Strong also articulated the backlash that such anxiety triggered. The so called white Anglo Saxon was the chief representative of a pure spiritual Christianity, a radical religious class with a special role in history decreed by God. This class had the power to shape its own destiny and was destined to survive. Men of this generation, from the pyramid top of opportunity on which God has set us, we look down on 40 centuries. We stretch our hand into the future with power to mold the destinies of unborn millions. Hmm. Now, withstanding the great perils which threaten it, I cannot think our civilization will perish. Strong sought to reassure his so called white Protestant readership that its present crisis could be reversed, but only if it seized its God given destiny. That meant resisting the influence of Roman Catholic immigrants and others and working to imprint the Anglo Saxon Protestant stamp on the American West and the rest of the world for strong protecting the nation Anglo Saxons populations and the integrity of its faith was the key to its domestic security. This kind of nativism developed in tandem with growing anxieties about other social problems associated with immigration. Worries about organized crime networks, for example, raised questions about Stickgate, a criminal force that had overseas connections. Charged with the role of safeguarding the nation, the Bureau of Investigations had to pursue its mission in an increasingly industrialized economically divided, uh, urbanized, and heterogeneous society, and the position of the DOJ and the Bureau and the resulting conflicts was solidified when anarchists declared war on capitalists, sending a bomb to the tycoon John D. Rockefeller and successfully bombing the home of U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer in 1919. It was at this time in August 1919 that a young J. Edgar Hoover, then only 26, was appointed head of the Bureau's General Intelligence Division, which set the stage for a massive roundup of pursuing radical labor union members and anarchists. The Palmer raids, from the perspectives of the DOJ and the Bureau, advocates of the labor movement and immigration and religious leaders sympathetically to the same were s- security threats, and it fell to officials like Hoover to defend against them. Progressive reform in its role as a defender of American society. The Bureau, as we have seen, also drew on the legacy of progressive ever moral reform, influential between the 1890s and the 1920s. Progressives, often motivated by strong religious beliefs, responded to the pressures of modernity, modernity and industrialization by trying to assert some control over society through self-discipline, vigorously activity, efficiently, and social and political interventions. In this day, they were following the example of antebellum reforms. Indeed, antebellum reformers targeted many of the same issues that the reformers of the progressive era will address, including temperance and um, prostitution. While the latter reforms exhibited similar moral concerns, however, the experience of the Civil War imposed a change of tactics. The primary tactic of the antebellum reformers was moral secession, trying to convince fellow Americans that their immoral behaviors would imperil not only their own individual souls, but also the welfare of the nation. They also stressed the importance of self discipline, as when Catherine Beecher urged readers of her treatise on domestic economy to pursue a habit of system in order and to have enough time to devote to religious reflection. And Minister John Todd explained to readers of his student manual how to eat, exercise, and brush their teeth as a perpetuatory step in the discipline of their hearts. After the Civil War, reformers began to back up their calls for moral self improvement by seeking legislation through purity laws. As political scientist James Monroe puts it, driven by the aspiration to enforce proper moral behavior or protect against immoral behavior deemed a threat to society. For example, the politician Anthony Cornstalk, who founded the New York Society for the super for the suppression of vice in 1873 to supervise the public's moral, induced Congress to pass the Comstock Law in the same year, which outlawed the transport and delivery of any obscene, lewd, or lascivious print or other publication of an indecent character or any article of or thing designed for the prevention of conception or procuring or of abortion, nor any article or thing intended or adopted for any indecent and immoral use or nature. Another example is the Woman Christian Temperance Union, founded soon after passage of the Comstock Law. The WCTU enlisted women in fighting impurity and intemperance because liquor turned men brutish, while mother love had the power to triumph over it, and it too sought legal changes in order to advance its moral agenda. France Willard, president of the WCTU from 1879 to her death in 1898, was a supporter of women's suffrage, for instance, because she believed that women's votes would help protect the virtue of society and the sobriety of men. Moral reformers in the late 19th century also tended to threat urbanization as a major threat to individual and collective well being. This led another social gospeler and supporter of women's suffrage, Jane Addams, to found Hull House, a settlement house in Chicago in 1889. The house was conceived as an experimental effort to aid in the solution of the social and industrial problems, which are engendered by the modern conditions of life in a great city. Life in the big city, lack outlets for one's active impulses, and Whole House was designed as a solution to this problem. Young people hear constantly of the great social maladjustment, she wrote, but no way is provided for them to change it, and their uselessness hangs about them heavily. These young people have had advantages of college, of European travel, and of economic study, but they are sustaining this shock of inaction. Other late 19th century outlets for the malaise of um, so-called white middle-class youth included the YMCA and the YWCA, the muscular Christian vogue for exercise and gymnasiums, and the trend of seeking adventures in the West to prove one's mettle and manliness. Theodore Roosevelt, the president under whom the Bureau was founded, embodied the idea a man mocked for his effort background who achieved a manly character through exercise and adventure, working as a rancher in the Dakota Territory, killing a buffalo, and so on. This era of progressive reform, coupled with the realization of muscular activity as a form of salvation, forms part of the background from which the Bureau of Investigation emerged and from which it developed its vaunted culture of virility excitement, morality, purity, and discipline. Consider as an example the role of the discipline in the Bureau's culture. From its very inception, the Bureau was supposed to be composed of highly disciplined men, and by discipline, we mean a moral discipline. In a letter to President Roosevelt, half a year after the July 1908 inauguration of the Bureau, A.G. Bonaparte acknowledged that it was difficult recruiting a trustworthy and efficient detective force. Detectives must have some acquaintance with the haunts and habits of criminals. Bonaparte stressed, and its members are obligated to frequently associate with and use in their work persons of extremely low moral standards, while detectives have to be conv- conversant in immorality in order to police it. However, it was equally crucial that they have the character to avoid falling into it themselves to prevent his force from degenerating into the evils which have caused and in some measure justified the dislike and suspicion entertained for the profession. Bonaparte proposed that the Bureau provided compensation and prestige sufficient to render the service attractive to intelligent and courageous men of good character and adequate education. He also flagged the importance of extremely strict discipline and the risks and in the ranks so that they may understand that any exhibition of insubordination or other form of official misconduct or any serious delinquency in morals or dissent or decent behavior will result in immediately separation of the guilty person from the force. Bonaparte's concept of the ideal detective echoes the role of discipline and progressive reform as the key to protecting the boundary between morality and immorality. The Bureau did not simply emulate the ethos of moral reform, it also continued the mission of reform because such moral reforms now had a legislative dimension. The newly formed Bureau also addressed some of the same social ills. It was the Bureau's responsibility, for example, to enforce the Cornstalk Law, along with the 1910 Mann Act, which outlawed the interstate transportation of woman for the purpose of prostitution or debauchery or for any other immoral purpose. For more or how on how the latter FBI sought to combat sex crime and obscenity, see Chapter 8 by Douglas M. Charles. The Mann Act incidentally illustrates the intersection of moral zeal, concern for the welfare of women, anxiety about the effects of urbanization and the racism fused into some versions of progressive reform. This law, also known as the so called White Slave Traffic Act, was motivated in part by a desire to protect susceptible young single European women who had moved to find work in cities where, among other perils, they ran the risk entering into interracial relationships. This is how the Bureau came to use the Mann Act to pursue and eventually convict Jack Johnson. These FBI people are real dirty. Yes, they are. The famous Moorish American boxer for having relationship with a European woman. A tragic example of how the Bureau's activities advance both the moral objectives of European progressive reform and its biases as well. We have sketched the fright racial landscape in which the Bureau of Investigation was founded at the beginning of the 20th century, a context that would condition its approach to religion and religious communities in later periods. In geographical terms, the nation was perhaps stronger than it had ever been, not only unified after vanquishing the Confederacy, but now also an international colonial power in the wake of war in Cuba and the Philippines. Still, American culture was also riven by racial, economic, and religious differences. Indeed, as the Bureau very own, the FBI, a Sentinel history, 1908 to 2008 argues by 1908 the time was right for a new kind of agency to protect America. And this charge, well, atmosphere, the Bureau arose as a major effort by the federal government to establish racial, ethnic, economic, and social order. That mission led to encounters with religion, conflicts with the Klan, pro union social gospelers, so called black Protestants, congregations, and others. It deemed a threat and alliances with those who would defend the social order or who sought to curb the moral ills of modern life. In this early period, the Bureau was a tiny operation. In 1908, it had only 23 agents and a limited jurisdiction, and its first major field office was created only when the Bureau began to enforce the Mann Act, but it was arguably already on the path that would later shape its interaction with various religious actors during the interwar period, the Cold War, the Civil Rights era, the Branch Davidian standoff, and the age of 9/11. Right? If God be for you, who can be against you? Okay. Persecution and vindication of the church of God in Christ during World War One. Theodore Cornwebber Jr. Alums about enemy, aliens, anti-capitalist labor, agitators, fifth columnists, and religious or unpatriotic slackers stirred the anxieties and prejudice of the American public during World War One. It is remarkable then that the arrest of Southern so-called black clergies on charges of obstructing the war effort elicit few headlines, although grand juries ultimately exonerated leaders of the Church of God in Christ. Before that vindication, they faced vigilante mobs and government officials intent on compelling patriotism and military service. The COGIC elders, like others advocating biblical convictions against war, fell victim to a serious wartime curtailment of religious expression and free speech. The agency tasked with enforcing the draft was the Bureau of Investigations, established in 1908 and renamed the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1935. Its earliest mission centered on enforcement of federal antitrust, land fraud, banking, naturalization, bankruptcy, and peonage laws. And in 1910, the Man what so-called White Slave Traffic Act, aside from a Mann Act vendetta against so-called blacks, right, which is a Moors boxing champion, Jack Johnson, who flaunted both his superiority over modern European pugilists and his quota of beautiful European women. The Bureau first took notice of the Moor population in 1915. So called blacks were beginning to scream out of the South, seeking good paying industrial jobs, better schools, less segregation, and the right to vote. This great migration, involving 1.5 million Moors who fled the South between 1915 and 1929, triggered a broad bureau inquiry when congressional Democrats claimed that Republicans were plotting to entice massive numbers of pillable so-called blacks into northern ghettos where they could be marched to the polls. After a nationwide investigation, several months long, the allegation proved groundless. The Bureau then refocused on customary matters unrelated to the so-called black population. Until the United States entered World War One, it had neither more agents nor insight into more life, including its religious diversity. The agents of this era were few in number and were typically middle class, modern European males with some legal experience who were assigned to the regions from which they came and which and with which they were presumably familiar. They were thus ill prepared by so-called race and class to fairly or articulate understand the distinctiveness of the Church of God in Christ. The COGIC story has a rare ironic twist, though. Despite federal persecution of the group, the legal system resisted both inflamed fears and super patriotic passions, thus ultimately permitting, if not guaranteeing, the exercise of religious expression. This is also one of the most striking examples of a more assertive mode, fueled largely by the migration raised expectations growing within more America. Moorish Americans acting on their religious convictions defied the federal government by refusing to perform military service. Despite broad public disapproval and the likelihood of prosecution, unsurprisingly, some Southern modern Europeans fell back on an ancient default. For them, outside agitators were stirring up an otherwise happy enslaved population, shades of Nat Turner. The Church of God in Christ, sacredly 2 decades old, had no established pacifist doctrine at the onset of World War One. In fact, its Pentecostal theology was still in flux as it expanded beyond its Baptist origins. Its founder, Elder Charles Harrison Mason, was born in the shadow of slavery. Various sources list his birth year as 1864 and 1866. His parents toured as agriculture laborers on a succession of farms and plantations in Tennessee and Arkansas. Although Mason attended school only to the fourth grade, he did not lack for scriptural training, being well taught by his missionary Baptist parents. Even as a child, he was said to have displayed unusual spiritual understanding in 1893. While still in his 20s, he led a revival in Preston, Arkansas, where many represented of their sins later that year, hoping that formal education would make him a better preacher. He enrolled in Arkansas Baptist College in Little Rock, only to leave after 3 months. The Lord showed me that there was no salvation in schools and colleges. Returning to life as itinerant preacher, Masons, Pentecostal theology developed in stages. Salvation will come through the preaching of a twofold blessing. The first blessing was conversion, a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ through a personal relationship with Jesus. The second was um, sanctification, the believer's purification from all sin. To these would latter be added a third blessing, baptism by the Holy Spirit, which first occurred on the day of Pentecost, as narrated in Acts 2. At that time, the Spirit promised by Jesus appeared in three supernatural, extraordinary manifestations. It first materialized as a sound like a wind, even though no wind was blowing. The second manifestation was tongues of fire descending on the believers. Finally, the believers were enabled to speak intelligibly and previously unlearned languages. This post conversion experiential experiential third blessing would become important as the Church of God and Christ's Pentecostal distinctiveness was refined in its first 2 decades. Capitalizing on this added blessings, Mason and three like minded preachers planted the seeds of a new Pentecostal movement while conducting a revival in Jackson, Mississippi in 1896. Great numbers were converted sanctified, and healed by the power of faith. But the theophanic aspects, particularly speaking in tongues and healing, were too demonstrative for most Baptists, whose doors subsequently closed to the evangelist, the owner of an unused cotton gin in Lexington, 63 miles north of Jackson, made it available for further revival meetings. And here in 1897, the first Church of God in Christ congregation was born. Spiritual warfare quickly ensued. The devil prompted persons unknown to fire pistols and shotguns during a miracle deliverance revival right into the midst of the saints while they were shouting and praying. While some were wounded, there were no fatalities. During the early years of the 20th century, holiness embers burst into flames, flaming widespread corners of the world. A particularly dramatic manifestation was the interracial Azu Street revival in Los Angeles, led by so called black evangelist Elder William J. Seymour, beginning in 1906. This revival was the turning point in Mason's life. Seymour began preaching the new doctrine of a third blessing, baptism by the Holy Ghost and fire, which empowered saints to cast out devils, heal the sick, and speak in other tongues. Soon, hundreds of so-called blacks and modern Europeans, including Mason, made pilgrimages to Seymour's renovated library stable on Azu Street, seeking the anointing of the Spirit. The doctrine of a third blessing provided Mason with the missing theological piece of the Pentecostal order. Now, based in Memphis, he went to Los Angeles, received the gift of tongues, and returned to spread the fire of revival. All night meetings, stretching over 5 weeks, aroused dramatic interest in the new Pentecostal worship and belief. A leadership rift soon occurred when some elders opposed the delusion of speaking in tongues. Mason was disfellowshipped by several of them, but other elders kept faith with him. Charles Harrison Mason was named general overseer and chief apostle of the Church of God in Christ at its first General Assembly in Memphis in 1907. Rapid growth took place in Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arkansas among rural sharecroppers and urban mill hands. Expansions into Texas soon followed. Then, as Moors, Texas migrated to the West Coast in the 1910s, the church established itself in Southern California under the leadership of Elder E.R. Driver. It also spread eastward with churches planted in Norfolk, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Detroit, and New York, and Harlem and Brooklyn. Expansions in up the Mississippi Valley led to outposts in St. Louis, Kansas City, and Chicago. Although the majority of the COGIC members were still concentrated in Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Texas. By 1917, the Burgoyne churches had congregations in all the major Midwestern and Eastern cities that major yeah, major Midwestern and Eastern cities that attracted Moors during the Great Migration. Despite its rapid growth, and the church will have remained invisible to modern Europeans who likely would not have noticed new urban storefront in rural southern sanctified congregations had it not been for World War I. The war brought unanticipated challenges and attention from public authorities as well as super patriotic vigilantes. It was the time of testing for the Church of God in Christ. In a supercharged wartime atmosphere, patriotic organizations and public officials alike exacerbated prejudice against uh, contentious objectives who were frequently accused of being enemy sympathizers, all but the most single minded devotees of unpopular causes found it prudent to fall silent and comply with patriotic demands. Religious objectors to participation in war suffered at times draconian persecution Neither the government nor the public was tolerant of those who believed God forbade them from rendering military service unto Caesar. Non religious objectors, including some Moors, faced even greater hostility. Those who were jailed suffered worse. The treatment of the imprisoned World War I resistance was barbaric, one historian concludes. Given such an intolerable popular mood, the Church of God in Christ leaders were fortunate to escape severe punishment after months of intense investigation, mainly by agents of the Justice Department. Two grand juries in Texas ultimately exercised unusual good sense in rejecting the arguments of federal prosecutors and in an ill-conceived attack on an inoffensive religious sect. Little did FBI agents foresee the power of faith and prayer they would encounter in their pursuit of the COGIC. America's modern domestic intelligence bureaucracy was birthed during World War I. The Secret Service, which historically had handled such security investigations, was muscled aside by fractious network of agencies that included the rapidly growing Bureau of Investigations, the Military Intelligence Division (MID) of the War Department, and the investigative arms of the Post Office and the State Department. Hmm. In tracking down alleged German spies, draft dodgers, and other species of subversives, the Bureau and the MID were assisted by more than 200,000 American Protective League Secret Service volunteers. Although these agencies deployed their operatives unevenly, they cast a broad net. Some of their actions, like apprehending draft evaders, were clearly mandated by law, but the business of catching spies, hunting subversives, and silencing dissenters rested on less certain foundations. Such pursuits were often motivated less by national security considerations and more by uh, exaggerated fears of subversion and public demand for enthusiastic patriotism. Bureau agents and their civilian assistants were armed with presidential executive orders and the Espionage Sedition and Trading with the Enemy Acts. These acts, vagueness, permitted federal prosecutors who were often responding to political pressure to define disloyalty and sedition very broadly. The civil liberties of Moors and Europeans, non citizens, and citizens took a beating, all with the approval of the federal courts. First Amendment guarantees of protected speech and press freedoms were not yet anchored in a substantial body of case law and legal doctrine, according to constitutional historian Paul L. Murphy. The story of civil liberties during World War I is a dreary, disturbing, and in some respects, shocking chapter out of the nation's past. Americans stood by on the domestic scene and saw liberty and justice uh, prostitute, prostituted in ways more extreme and extensive than at any other time in American history. World War I generated widespread fears, at times approaching the level of hysteria. The German agents were poised to sabotage the United States either by their own acts by sowing desertion among the population. There were enough isolated instances of German intrigue, for example, the Tom explosion, to give credence to the belief that enemy agents lurked everywhere. Many Europeans, particularly in the South, believed that such plotters were talking deliberate pains to propagandize Moorish Americans. Moors, it was imagined, were easy targets for manipulation and their grievance readily exploited. Given such a climate of alarm and South, any unfamiliar modern European persons living, working, or trading among so called blacks, any demolition and accommodating behavior, or simply any nighttime gatherings were seen as evidence of enemy influence or disloyal intentions. Bureau agents investigated hundreds of such rumors. Actual German plots to incite so called blacks to acts of treasons were non existent, but not a few so called blacks wished for German success as punishment for European racism. Some may actually have believed that a German victory would bring them economic and social equality. In the end, these phenomena produced new victims. So called blacks suspected of harboring such sentiments were often arrested at the behest of Bureau agents and harshly interrogated or jailed. Few modern Europeans, and certainly only a handful in federal or local law enforcement, possessed the insight to understand that migration and war had exponentially raised um, so called blacks' aspirations and dissatisfaction with the racial status quo. It was simpler and more confronting to believe that a diabolical enemy was subverting an otherwise contented race. Leaders and members of COGIC drew the scrutiny of the federal government because church doctrine forbade the shedding of blood, a belief that compelled their noncompliance with the draft. The Department of Justice was responsible for enforcement of selective service regulations. U.S. attorneys prepared legal cases while the rapidly expanding Bureau of Investigation gathered evidence and apprehended non-registrants registrants and refusers. Constitutional liberties were often trampled, the most notorious example being the 1918 slacker raids. Although caught in the crossfire of public intolerance, the zealous enforcement of conscription, COGIC members, and other religious objectives refused to disobey the scriptures, although Elder Mason and other church members did not articulate political or radical opposition to the war or raise challenges to the racial status quo. Their willingness to stand up to the government and its European symbols of authority is evidence of a larger willingness to abandon Booker right acco- accommodations and more assertively seek racial progress. By the time the United States entered the war in April 1917, millions had already died on the battlefields of Europe. Soldiers had to be conscripted quickly if the United States was to have a decisive combat role. Congress in creating the draft provided that only consensuous objectors who were members of religious bodies opposed to participation in war would be granted exemptions. President Wilson declared that members of a recognized religious sect or organization that had a creed prohibiting military service were eligible for exemption from combat, but they still had to perform non combatant duty. That is, there was no provision for complete exemption or for alternative service. Under civilian direction, applicants had to convince local draft boards of the sincerity of their beliefs. In practice, the Mennonites, Quakers, Church of the Brethren, and a few smaller long-time pacifist sets were the only denominations whose pacifism was recognized without extreme difficulty, and the government demanded that even they don military uniforms and work under military discipline. Hundreds who refused to cooperate were court martialed and sentenced to long abusive terms at maximum security prisons such as Alcatraz and Leavenworth. 17 men received death sentences through their sentences were commuted after the war. Public opinion associated consensuous objections with anti-capitalist radicals and pro-German sympathizers, and Assistant Secretary of War admitted the public's dislike and distrust of this small minority of Americans professing conscientious objections to warfare. The public often made little distinction between conscientious objections and disloyalty. A refusal to bear arms was tantamount to treason. The administration of the draft was compromised not only by the hostile public opinion, but also by biases and inconsistencies on the part of draft boards. Southern boards, staffed typically by local middle and upper class modern European patriots, were ill equipped to assess even handily the claims of members of the Church of God in Christ for exemption on the biases of concise in general, so-called blacks were much more likely to be declared fit and eligible for for induction than were the modern Europeans because they want to send our people out to war and do all their crimes, you know what I mean, and be subjected to be killed out there and have post-traumatic syndromes. If you want to go and take over other Aboriginal people's lands and stuff, you need to let them do that on their own because you shouldn't be in their wars. You know what I mean? And that was a big conspiracy that, you know, some dirt that the FBI was doing back in those days, trying to force people that were Aboriginal and that were Moors, you know what I mean? Because you had tax exemption, you was military exempt. Okay? When you were in the Moorish Science Temple of America, and you claim to be Moor and you claim your nationality. You know what I mean? That's why those protections was afforded by the prophet because he was exact and correct because your religious protections and then you have your national protections. That what makes you divine and national. Okay? Now, the delinquents was more than 2 to 1. Given such attitudes and policies, the elder Mason and members of the Church of God in Christ were guaranteed tribulation in 1917 and 1918, despite COGIC professions of patriotism and love for country. The public misunderstood the church stand against participation in war. Church doctrine refined during World War One, including an unambiguous prohibition on combatant military service, Jesus Christ's teaching on the virtue of brotherly love and the sinfulness of hating others called for obedience. We believe the shedding of human blood or taking of human life to be contrary to the teaching of our Lord and Savior. And as a body, we are advised to war, well, averse to war in all its various forms. This was not the same as being sympathetic to Germany. Addressing a large baptismal gathering on June 23rd, 1918, Mason preached a sermon entitled The Seer in the Light of the Scriptures. The German ruler was said to be the beast of Antichrist. I mean, the Kaiser in the light of the Scriptures. The German ruler was said to be the beast or Antichrist depicted in Revelation 13. Mason found scriptural approval in Matthew 5:42 for the purchase of Liberty bonds, and he would later claim to have raised more than 3,000 for that cause. His sermon ended in prayer not only that all peoples will beat their swords into plowshares and study war no more, but also that the German hordes would be driven back behind their borders. But while offering such patriotic assurances, Mason still encouraged male pras- parishioners to seek conscientious objector status. Elder Mason first drew federal scrutiny in September 1917 when an alarmed Chancery Court clerk in Lexington, Mississippi, warned authorities that the so-called black preacher openly advised against registration and made treasonable and seditious remarks against the United States government. The Church of God in Christ had many members in Holmes County in Mississippi, Delta region, where so-called blacks constituted nearly 80% of the population, and local modern Europeans worried not only about meeting draft quotas, but about maintaining modern European racial dominance and privilege. Bureau of Investigation agent M.M. Schroenberger, whose jurisdiction included Rural Mississippi and Louisiana was assigned to verify these allegations, interviewing indigenous whites who attended Mason's assemblies. He learned that the Negro revivalist preacher had conducted nightly meetings, so called Negro revivalist preacher, because we know he's a Moor. Okay. During the first 2 weeks in August, with overflow crowds of 2 or 3 thousand, Mason was said to exert as much influence over his race as did Billy Sunday among modern Europeans, and to have amassed considerable personal wealth, including 60,000 mansions in Memphis. Informants charged that he taught opposition to war and bloodshed, while informing his members they need not register for the draft. Whose Schroenberger learned that Mason had allegedly labeled the present conflict a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, in which so called blacks had no grudge against the Germans, a good people who treated so called blacks better than did other modern Europeans. Mason was said to have praised Germany so profusely that one of his fellow preachers threatened to quit the church. Schrumberger believed all this was sufficient to convict Mason of committing treason, obstructing the draft, and giving aid and comfort to the enemy, particularly since two church members had not reported for induction. Confident, confident of prosecution, Schrimberg obtained sworn statements from members of both races. The affidavits of 4 members of the Black Mississippi Cavalry who had attended Mason's meetings were couched, however, in such racially guarded language that they proved to be useless. Stromberg noted ruefully, while all the men know by reputation that Mason is a menace to the country, they are unable to furnish direct testimony. Hence, on its first attempt to prosecute Mason, the government was steamed, possessing only hearsay evidence. Of course, this failure did not do nothing to ally the racial anxiety of local modern Europeans or federal authorities. So, all this time, the FBI been covert um, agitators and manipulators, and they made us into trading with the enemy act. Um, you know, they have a state apparatus to enforce their colorable legalese laws and codes and statutes. Okay, and they've been doing this for a long time, Morris. So pay attention. Now, the next individual to come under government supervision and suspicion was Elder E.R. Driver, overseer of COGIC churches in California and one of the denomination's founders. He was summoned to the Bureau office in Los Angeles in February 1918 and accused of being pro German and bitter toward the government. Driver insisted on his loyalty while defending the church's opposition to taking life, but Agent George T. Holman was skeptical of Driver's patriotism. This uh, Moorish minister is supposed to have considerable influence among a number of people of his race, and his attitude is very aggressive with reference to this country's interest into the war. It would be possible for him to be of considerable menace to the country. See, they're gonna make you a terrorist because you don't have the same scope and concern and mindset as them, so they want to make you an enemy, and that's not American. That's not constitutional. That's not protecting the American citizens, and that's not upholding the constitutional principles and values that is already guaranteed and secured through the Constitution. So claiming your nationality is a must, more is because that's the only way you're going to be able to enforce your autonomy and your sovereign right. You know what I mean? So, considerable minutes to the country, the agent vowed to keep driver under observation and halt his activities should they become pronounced. Such a confrontation was typical. Bureau conscription cases files are replete with records of inquisitional interviews in which agents argued with suspects, assailed them with patriotic bombast, and threatened them to gain compliance with the draft. So they're gonna stalk you, bully you, make you under threat and cohesion and assault, and make you join the draft. Ain't that something? They got the power to enforce it, right? They can just lock you up and throw away the key, right? Ain't that treason though? Ain't that criminal though? Hmm. Now, many Southern and modern Europeans suspected that so-called blacks, Moors, loyalty had been subverted by German gold. Beliefs about such dastardly deeds were seemingly confirmed by an April 1st, 1917 headline in the Vicksburg Post: Draft evasions in Holmes County due to pro German teachers among so called blacks. The paper reported that the state adjutant general's office, which commanded the Mississippi National Guard, had found it virtually impossible to persuade Lexington, okay, um, so called blacks to comply because of Mason's allegedly pro German sermons and advice to resist conscription. Investigators accepted as factual the rumor that 3 weeks earlier a mysterious foreigner, Demetrius Giannaculon, had conducted a meeting at Mason's church during which he received a message in code. To anxious Montpellier Europeans, there was no coincidence between this information and the allegation that Mason was suddenly wealthy, enjoying a new brick and stone residence in Memphis. The situation seemed all the more sinister because in the preceding 2 months, only a small proportion of several hundred Moors uh, registrants had reported for induction. And desperation, the adjutant general published the names of 70 alleged Holmes County draft dodgers, offering a $50 reward for each one delivered to the nearest military post. The story, Lincoln Mason, yeah, Geno Coulon, and draft resistance was picked up by the National Wire Services, which spread this fantastic tale of German intrigue across the country. Only so called black newspapers such as the New York Age debunked the idea of enemy subversion through Mason's church. It called instead for an investigation of Southern draft boards said to be inducting all so called black registrants, regardless of fitness, while exempting many eligible modern Europeans. So, boom, through war, they want to induct, draft all Aboriginal people to fight their wars so they can blow you up and destroy you, leave your um, women and children, you know what I mean, while you go fight their wars and then still be their debt slave. Hmm. Pretty American, right? Huh. Right? So these revelations prompted the Bureau of Investigation to open a new case on Elder Mason at the same time, thanks to the patriotic tip of a local U.S. Food Administration official. The military intelligence section of the War Department was alerted to this perceived threat to preparedness. Henceforth, the Bureau and Army officers would share information on Mason and the Church of God in Christ. Agent Harry D. Gully found matters to be somewhat different from the reports in the exotic press. Local officials in Lexington told him that the number of so called black draft respondents was indeed alarmingly low, but that part of the blame lay with the draft board's inefficiency and poor record keeping. Nothing was learned about Geno Clunian. Though Gully heard new rumors of five suspicious foreigners, three Germans, an Englishman, and a Frenchman, who were believed to have some connection with Mason. Gully interviewed alleged draft delinquents held in the local jail, but only one had been to Mason's church, and he denied hearing any draft propaganda. Hearsay that charged Mason with supporting Germany and holding secret anti-draft meetings at 3 o'clock in the morning also surfaced. Although Gully could substantiate nothing, he nonetheless concluded that so-called blacks had evidently been admonished not to talk war talk. One church member did agree to speak with Gully, but James Lee, one of five ordained COGIC preachers in Holmes County, insisted that neither he nor Mason had preached anti draft or anti war messages. Gully's only success was in obtaining several church documents, including doctrinal statements drawn up the previous August by Mason and elders W.B. Holt, uh, W.B. Holt and Modern Europeans, and E.R. Driver. The peace affirmed loyalty to all God given institutions, including magistrates, civil laws, the Constitution, the President, and the flag, while also stating that taking life or shedding blood was contrary to the teachings of Jesus. Church members were allowed to perform any other service that did not conflict with the no bloodshed principle. Of subsequent intense interest to the Bureau was a blank petition signed by Mason and addressed to draft boards to be used by registrants seeking exemption based on church doctrine. Another document was an earlier doctrinal statement written by Hall as long before as 1895 forbidding members to shed blood to bear arms. Despite the absence of specific evidence, Gully was convinced that church leaders had induced so-called blacks to disobey the draft law and that doctrinal statements against war had only recently been adopted supposedly to increase membership. Disregarding Holt's 1895 document, Gully also warned that the COGIC's recent association with the white church, so-called white churches, right, he didn't like, in the West could well be the result of German anti-draft activities, lacking even a shed of concrete evidence of such activities. Gully urged the U.S. Attorney in Jackson and bureau agents in Memphis and Los Angeles to further investigate Mason, Hope, and Driver. So he wanted to keep, you know, a very close tab on these guys, and he wanted to investigate and make something nothing, and he didn't want to, value the Constitution, because these guys don't operate to value the Constitution; they operate to break it and then violate your constitutional rights. It happens all the time on these platforms, and going into these courts, and you know we have a broad history of and inducement fraud going on with the Aboriginal peoples here, labeled as brands, Negroes, colors, African Americans, etc. So, ironically, by assuring townsfolk that the menace was being taken seriously, Gully's investigation gave Mason temporary protection from outraged modern European Lexingtonans. Events elsewhere had demonstrated that when worried patriots felt no government action was forthcoming, vigilantism vigilantism could easily occur. One victim of such action was Reverend Jesse Payne, a COGIC pastor in Blettville, Arkansas, 60 miles upriver from West Memphis, who was fortunate to escape with his life on April 18, 1918, under the headline so-called Negro preacher, but you know they put Negro on him. Um, tarried the Memphis Commercial Appeal report that this pastor of the so-called colored holy sect roller church in the southeast suburbs of this city was given a coat of tar and feathers last night as a result of alleged seditious remarks for some months concerning the president, the war, and a modern European man's war. Earlier in the evening, the preacher is alleged to have said something about the um, Kaiser being as good a man as the president, and that the Kaiser did not require his people to buy bonds, and someone landed a solar plexus on him, sending him into the ditch from which he got up running. After being tarred and feathered, Payne repeated the soldier's oath and promised to talk liberty, bonds, and Red Cross to the end of his life and the end of the war. It is said his flock has shown no interest in the war work, while the so-called Negroes of other churches have been most liberal. 2,000 having been subscribed by the Methodist and Baptist Church this Sunday night. This church is circulating literature which he says was sent to him by a brother preacher in Memphis, showing from Bible quotations that it is not right for Christians to fight. The literature is scattered broadcast over the country. The newspaper concluded by editorializing the pastor's punishment will results in good and great good to demonstrate to not only so-called blacks but some so-called whites that it is time to get into the war work and quit talking so such. Okay, right as is a tribute to pain. Bureau of Investigation personnel continued COGIC inquiries in the South and West. Mason agreed to an interview with Memphis special agent in charge, W.E. McElveen, in which he claimed to have advised those who became church members after passage of the Draft Act to register, but also to claim consensuous object the exemptions, recommending that church members should respect and obey current laws. Mason also said he sent a telegram to President Woodrow Wilson after passage of the Draft Act explaining the church doctrines and offering to meet with him. Regulations concerning conscientious objections had been sent to Mason, which he claimed to have followed, proclaiming his patriotism. Mason avowed support for Liberty Bond war stamps and Red Cross drives. Despite these statements, and even though Mason denied any outside funding or pro German preaching in COGIC pulpits, McElvin remained convinced of German influence in the church. Finding nothing concrete to confirm suspicions of subversion, McElveen concluded that Mason was less extreme than other religious objectors, such as the Seventh day Adventists. In light of uh, McElveen's concern, Mason remained under surveillance. After Mason conducted a camp meeting in late May at ER Drive, Los Angeles, church local agents of the American Protective League, the organization of more than 200,000 Secret Services volunteers, supplied the Bureau with an excited report of dramatic increases in COGIC membership due, it was alleged, to members thereby receiving non-combatant statuses. The web of suspicion went further with the APL reporting that several members of Java's church were German and that other wealthy Teutons gave generous donations, fine authors quite frequently stop at the above church, and their occupants are of a strong German type, and modern European neighbors who did not appreciate the late night rivals reported receiving threats. Propaganda, see? They just want to start confusion. By now, Bureau of Investigation headquarters in Washington was keenly monitoring the case. In the opinion of a chief, a Bruce Bileski, enough evidence had been amassed from Mississippi, Tennessee, and California by the late spring of 1918 to warrant Mason's prosecution, believing that there is some special biases for compliant of pro-German activities in these sections of the country. He directed that a strong case should be prepared in order to make a striking example of some of the alleged agitators. At this point, events overtook the Bureau, forcing it to guard the life of the man it suspected. Elder Mason returned to Lexington in early June 1918, unaware of the seriousness of the antipathies of local modern Europeans who blamed him for an alarming decline in draft compliance. Many so called black registrants had failed to appear for induction. When apprehended, they produced COGICs, petitions containing religious objections to war. Modern European residents claimed Mason had told would be converts that if you want to stay out of this war, you must get right with God and join my church. There is no occasion for the so called Negroes to go to war. The Germans are the best friends the so called Negroes have. Germany is going to whip the United States for the mistreatment accorded the so called Negroes. If for no other reason, there is a rich man war anyway. A lynching appeared likely, prompting the sheriff to protect Mason by arresting him for obstructing the draft. This action, plus news of imminent intervention by federal authorities, momentarily quelled the mob spirit. But when Agent Eugene Palmer arrived in Lexington, he discovered local modern Europeans were not pacified by the arrest. Fearing the worst, Palmer borrowed the sheriff's car, got Mason out of jail, and drove him the 13 miles to Durant, where they caught a southbound Illinois Central Railroad train arriving safely in Jackson. Arraigned there on draft obstruction charges, Mason pleaded not guilty, waived the preliminary hearing, and posted 2,000 bond, guaranteeing his appearance in federal court in November. Meanwhile, back in Lexington, a large number of so-called black men said to have been influenced by Mason were summarily rounded up and sent to Camp Pike, Arkansas for induction. In numerous instances during the war, alarmed Southern Europeans, modern Europeans found it difficult to believe that so-called blacks could hold genuine anti-war beliefs or have persuasive reasons for being disenchanted with the war. It was much more comforting to believe their dissatisfaction was the result of enemy agents manipulating gullible blacks, so-called blacks. The hoary Southern myth of outside agitators stirring up an otherwise contented so-called black population had clearly not died with slavery because they are producing slavery right now because the whole thing of slavery is to bring that and put those marks upon you because them themselves was Slavics and slaves themselves. So now they want to give you the brunt end of the stick. So the Jackson Daily News Hall Mason arrest as an important step in countering German propaganda, holding the preacher responsible not only for the large number of Holmes County so-called blacks who allegedly evaded the draft, but also for making false statements for the purpose of promoting the cause of Germany and detrimental to the military um, welfare of the United States. When Palmer examined Mason's several pieces of anointed cloth. Okay, no, Mason's suitcase, however, he found nothing to establish an enemy connection other than several pieces of anointed cloth and a bottle of German cologne with which to perform the consecration. Meanwhile, the Military Intelligence Division, which conducted unhindered and widespread investigations of civilians during the war, was mustering its own evidence against Mason. Like the Bureau of Investigation, MID developed a focus on alleged so-called black subversives, as well as any activity threatened to deter enlistment. Colonel, Colonel, I mean, Colonel Marlborough Churchill, the current head of MID, instructed intelligence officers in Los Angeles and St. Louis to investigate elders E.R. Driver, W.B. Holt, and Randolph R. Booker to determine whether there was German influence behind the church consensus objection stand. He addressed a similar letter to the bureau chief, uh, Belinsky, recommending further investigation of the COGIC leaders and its propaganda and urging that the inquiry concerning William B. Holt should be especially rigid. The Churchill explained that Holt is a modern European man, very insulting and overbearing in manner, and that he had traveled all the way from Los Angeles to Jackson to arrange bail for Mason, putting up 2,000 in cash. So they want to be mad about that. You know, how can this European come, modern European, and make this bond for the so-called black man, right? Because Germany know about the Moors, Islam. So, soon thereafter, the Bureau opened a case on Henry Kevin, pastor of a COGIC congregation in Paris, Texas, although it believed that Kervin was undermining military preparedness. Mason was the real target of the case. Agent DeWitt S. Wynn, a former Burns Detective Agency sleuth, unearthed information that, if probable, would have damned the entire church leadership. Kervin was reported as saying the Red Cross was the blood of the beast, described in the book of Revelation, and warning his flock not to contribute to that charity. Wynn also learned that Kervin's congregation contribute $125 so that he could accompany Mason to Washington to gain draft deferments from Woodrow Wilson personally. Not surprisingly, the two did not see the president, but did meet with a selective service official who supposedly arranged members' immunity from the draft and from Red Cross, Liberty Bond, and War Thrift Stamp contributions. Henceforth, each member of Kervin's congregation, adult and child, was assessed 25 cents monthly, allegedly, on the authority of the president to ensure congregants, yeah, congregants exemptions. So after he did that, they still trying to force a case. What's going on with these people? Learning that Mason Holt and Kervin were in Austin raising funds for Mason's legal defense, Wynn telephoned Agent Claude McCabe to urge investigations. Though not a hasty arrest, McCabe covered Mason's meeting but heard nothing incriminating. Undeterred, McCabe, Wynn, and U.S. Attorney Clarence Merritt continued to prepare a case for prosecution. Records of Kervin's church were examined. Hope, whom McCabe fancied was German, was already jailed in Paris on charges of possessing a gun, which suggests that federal and state authorities and perhaps local officials were all uh, cooperating on the case. But no probable charges had yet been levied against Mason and Kevin. When grilled by McCabe, Kervin described how, on orders from Mason, all church's members had been enrolled the previous January and assessed 25 cents monthly for legal representation of men who might be drafted. But he denied discouraging Red Cross participation, and said, I am now teaching that nations ought to chastise one another. Mason was interviewed once again, and in that interview, he maintained that although the part of the COGIC doctrinal statement detaining opposition to military service was first printed in 1917 after the draft law was passed, it had long been an article of faith. There had simply been no need to publish it earlier. Denying unpatriotic motives, Mason avowed that he was just trying to teach the scriptures. Answering questions about hope, he declared that the European elder had joined the church in May 1917 as the superintendent of Spanish missions. Here, Mason was less than candid. Elder Holt had been appointed National Field Secretary at the COGIC, founding back in 1897. Concerning Holt's arrest for weapons possession, Mason explained that he was authorized to carry a badge and gun as deputy sheriff in California. So now you see how they flip the government and stop Moors from being Moors and having rights that is secured within the Constitution. Now, Henry Curvin and Charles H. Mason were arrested on July 16, 1918. That's why the Prophet came in 1913. Okay, and changed along with William B. Hope with impersonating federal officers and conspiring to commit offenses against the government. The former infraction carried a maximum 3 year sentence and 1,000 fine, and latter permitting a 10,000 penalty and 2 years incarceration. These were federal offenses. Regarding the first charge, Mason was said to have told church members he was an emissary of President Wilson with authority to collect 25 cents monthly to ensure their exemption from military service. The Paris Morning News coarsely simplified the issue headlining that Mason was charged with working holy roller so-called Negro. So they want to say, even though you got protections on through religious protections that's secured, right, through the Constitution, they still want to say he was taking advantages of Negroes because um, you looked at as their stock. So they got to punish him for, you know, uh, waking his people up and trying to save his people. You know what I mean? But they in a status of Negro. So this has been going on for a minute, and that's why the Most High Allah sent us our illustrious universal prophet, Noble Drew Ali. Know what I mean? But we have a lot of people who come in and try to infiltrate what the prophet brought and change up certain things that he brought and have us all confused and combobulated. All these so-called scholars that um, take on these pseudo studies and redirect language and use language to enslave the people mentally. Okay, and they became great wizards and witches because it was the word and it was God and and it was God and the word. You know what I mean? So you have to know the word so you can give a great precise meaning when you're professing the word. You know what I mean? So Holt remained in jail, unable to raise 5,000 bond, an extraordinarily high amount. The others were released on their own recognizance, given a climate in which modern European outsiders were often suspected of being enemy agents, right? Halt was clearly deemed the more dangerous. A trial date was set for late October, which suited federal prosecutors who would have to work hard to present a credible conspiracy case. That word conspiracy again. That was a made up term, propaganda to convict innocent Moors. Okay, innocent men, innocent people. Right? They've been doing this. Okay, but these were no ordinary times. By July, American troops were finally engaged in combat on the Western Front. Back in Mississippi, the entire National Guard, including infantry, um, field, artillery, cavalry, and engineers, was pressed into active duty. Islam, Tawheed, Islam, more peace, 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 more. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, Agent V.W. Killick gathered additional evidence against the defendants, interviewing elder driver, overseer of COGIC churches in California. He denied being a Negro, okay, claiming his father was an East Indian who married a so-called black woman, okay? So there we go with nationality again. There we go with into marriage, into relations. That's why the prophet said, do not amalgamate, because the modern Europeans already been living off your virtues, okay? And our people have been taught certain labels and brands to be a fact and race, okay? And that's not, no, that's not possible, because that has been indoctrinated into our system, within our psyche, through their school system, okay? So the indoctrination is very wide and spread, and that's why a lot of our people have problems with digesting this information. But now to be presented to you what the FBI and the so-called national security of the United States corporation has been induced within our people brands, and have been taking advantage, and been using our own people to do those certain taking advantages. And and then they want to say, oh, why um more is always, you know calling out these certain people, because they got to know what they're doing so they can correct themselves. So misunderstood, um and claiming his father was an East Indian who married a so-called black woman after the son's birth. That bit of irrelevancy aside, Driver described Mason as devoted heart and soul to his ministry, adding that Mason was sometimes misunderstood because of his lack of formal education. Driver claimed never to have heard Mason criticize the government or encourage evasion of military duty. Rather, Mason had instructed the COGIC members who were drafted to seek positions that did not necessarily, uh, necessitate their engaging in the actual taking of human life. Killick tried to bait Driver, arguing the non-combatant soldiers were also culpable since they helped those actually fighting in response. Driver maintained that non-combatants were observed before God of any wrongdoing, convinced of neither of the church nor Driver's sincerity. Killick concluded with a partiality not uncommon to bureau agents of that era, that his attitude was very commanding and dictatorial, and his general personality very repugnant. I could easily imagine that this man, if crossed and aggravated, might become wildly fanatical on any issue which might confront him. In my opinion, I do not believe that the principle of opposition to warfare was ever established as a fundamental of this church prior to the entrance of the United States into the war. I believe that the members of this church were anxiously um, desirous of evading military service in every respect, but could conspiratorial intent be proven in court of law, a jury well, impartial one at least was unlikely to be convinced by the Bureau's evidence to this point. Meanwhile, the fear of German subversion still preoccupied Army intelligence officials. Upon receipt of Agent Wynn's reports, Mid requested still more surveillance to determine if enemies or allies were promoting obstruction of the draft. Mid operatives tapped drivers' telephones in a futile attempt to prove German associations. Colonial Church Hill's office waited impatiently for the trial of Mason, Holt, and Curvin, stressing to John Lloyd O'Brien, the special assistant to the Attorney General responsible for overseeing Espionage Act cases, that prosecution was fairly important for our counter propaganda work. See, they got to have their propaganda to counter the truth. I'm telling you right here, as there are outcroppings of this so called Negro religious agitation in other parts of the country with which we have to deal. This was a reference to the Pentecostal assemblies of the world, churches of the living God, Church of God, and saints in Christ, and the so called Black Church of Christ congregations, all of which similarly oppose participation in the war, right? So, anytime you're going against their narrative, anytime you're going against their agenda, okay, they want to punish you for that. Is that liberty? Is that justice? Or is that tyranny? You be the judge. If the Department of Justice was to succeed in prosecuting Mason and his associates through hearsay evidence was insufficient, credible firsthand testimony by church members was essential. The most promising witnesses appeared to be Reverend W.C. Thompson, who had left the church in disagreement over performing military service, interviewed by bureau agents in Chicago. Thompson alleged that the COGIC members were discouraged from buying Liberty bonds because Mason wanted them to give him money for a new house. He charged further that Curvin's anti war stance was simply for personal gain, to the Bureau's charging. However, Thompson defended Mason and Curvin's as basically patriotic, even if mistaken. This was hardly the smoking gun that the Justice Department needed in order to convict the COGIC leaders. The government suffered another setback when the sudden death of DeWitt, when and the influenza epidemic left the Bureau without its most informed, diligent, and professional operative on the case. When replacement Louis H. Henry continued assisting U.S. Attorney Merritt in preparing the case for a federal grand jury. Using the parish church registry, Henry took statements from 13 members, including two lay preachers, gaining much new information, but no solid evidence that federal crimes had been committed. The members, right, related how after his trip to Washington with Mason, Pastor Curvin instructed the congregation to pay 25 cents to register so that the president would know who the saints of the church were. All those paying and so enrolled would not have to go to war, but those who did not would be cut off from the church and afforded no protection from military service. Women were urged to register too so as to avoid forced Red Cross work. Members were also required to purchase for 15 cents a document entitled Doctrine and Statement and Rules for Government of the Church of God in Christ, which stated that we believe the shedding of human blood or the taking of human life to be contrary to the teachings of our Lord and Savior. And as a body, we are adverse to war in all its various forms. If men were inducted, Curvin said they could use the pamphlet to plead for mercy and not be sent to the front lines. Members were admonished to live the life if they expected the church to stand behind them. Church finances were also investigated, but nothing useful for the prosecution came to light. What most shocked Agent Henry was learning that Holt hugged and kissed Mason. The culturally unsophisticated bureau agent interpreted this as a shocking display of interracial intimacy rather than as what it was, the holy kiss, a scriptural form of Christian greeting. See, they always trying to make something into something. They always try to make something into something. Okay, just because they doing that, they doing certain, you know, devilish stuff. They want to put you with it, right? On October 29, 1918, even as newspaper headlines predicted the imminent collapse of Germany and its allies, a federal grand jury convened in Paris, Texas, to weigh evidence against Mason, Curvin, and Holt. A large number of church members attended the hearing, presided over by Judge Duval, west of San Antonio, no stranger to cases of alleged so called black disloyalty. Surprisingly, despite local prejudices and passions, the grand jury declined to indict the three on the charge of conspiring to hinder the draft, finding that the preacher's activities were not conducted in a way that was covered by any federal statute. It found no more merit in the charge of impersonating government officials. Disappointed but unwilling to admit defeat, the assistant U.S. attorney prosecuting the case suggested that the defendants next be tried in Lamar County Court for swindling in connection with the monthly assessments. Agent Henry persuaded County Attorney Grandy Scroden to prosecute, promising access to all evidence gathered by the Bureau. So on November 1st, the defendants were back in custody. Local prosecution, in which modern European racial fears might easily be exploited, was potentially dangerous. The press focused particularly on Holt, reported to have eaten and lodged with so called blacks and had to have hugged and kissed a so called black preachers. Curvin and Mason made bond, but again, Holt's bond was set higher and he could not raise the sum. The Paris Morning News in language coming to the southern white, so called white press reported the modern European man was arrested with the so called Negro holy roller preachers on the charge of swindling is still in jail. None of the brethren have so far made bond for him, although the darkies have been released. So you see how they trying to make this a racial thing, okay? When all of them supposed to be in so-called Jesus Christ church, Yeshua's church, but here go the feds with the bull crap. Okay, now this final attempt to prosecute the Church of God and Christ's leadership must have ended in futility, right? Because it was futile. It was wasn't fruitful. You know, what I mean, the Paris Morning News did not mention the trio after November 5th. The minutes indexes for both the federal district and Lamar County courts contain no information, and the county grand jury did not keep minutes in this era. Apparently, only William B. Holt was convicted. He pleaded guilty to vagrancy on December 6th and was fined $1. This was the last record harassment of the COGIC's modern European elder. Okay. Elder Mason saw his legal ordeals in Mississippi and Texas as nothing less than persecution, and the evidence supports his interpretation. The church anti war doctrine, in all likelihood, antedated the declaration of war in April and the induction of the draft in May 1917. The fact that it was not published earlier is inconsequential. There simply was no need before the war to devolve into tangible, a tangential subject like contentious um, objection. What was important was possession by the Spirit as evidenced by speaking in tongues or miracles, healing. Clearly, neither Mason nor the other COGIC pastors were pro German. Mason's sermon and and the Kaiser, in the light of the scriptures, expressed clear opposition to German policy and a willingness to support Liberty Bond drives. It is equally clear that there was never a conspiracy to obstruct the draft, but ordinary citizens and public officials alike were um, disinclined to differentiate between religious objection to all wars and opposition to the present conflict. Part of the reason was that other so called blacks did express unmistakable political dissent. Moorish Americans, socialists such as A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen, editors of The Messenger, viewed the war as the inevitable product of exploitative capitalism, and many other so called blacks, including ex Southerners, trapped in northern urban ghettos where the promised land seemed as remote as ever, saw no reason to fight a modern European man's war. By contrast, the COGIC doctrine was a political. The church should have excited no more interest or disfavor than did the Quakers. So they just standing on their religious principles. And these people want to come and try to take them to court and throw them in court and jail them because of their religious doctrine and their power through their religious doctrine that is protected through the Constitution. So these people has advertently been a damn pain in our people's side for a long time. But we have these debates all the time with Moors, okay, that calling themselves black, okay, and saying that we are in a government, which in actuality we're not. Okay, we're in a corporation and that we're supposed to be self-governing with our own autonomy. That's why the Moorish Science Temples was created by our holy prophet, Noble Drew Ali. But those were infiltrated too, and those were taken over by certain individuals that was already conspiring within the shrine of temples, Suleiman them, you know what I mean, and they already tried to go against the prophet. So it was a lot of things going on in history that is not taught, okay, to our people. Now, regarding the allegation that Mason impersonated a government official, the evidence is no stronger. It is clear that the 25-cent assessments were to pay for the legal costs incurred by Mason, other arrested leaders, and those seeking draft exemption. This was probably the easiest way to raise a defense. Okay? Fund, and the money collected seems to have been used appropriately. Mason may have naively assumed from his talks with draft officials in Washington that the government approved his church's anti war doctrines and that this approval was sufficient to ensure exemption from conscription, at least for those men who were COGIC members before passage of the Selective Service Law. Inexperience in dealing with the wider war world, right? Mason relied less on the nonsense of the law than on the strength of a sovereign God, whom he knew far better. So, the sovereign God, okay, that's why religion is the protection, okay, within the national principles, within the civics. So when these people tell you that, oh, that is sovereign citizenry and all this, that, and the third, no, 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 no. You have protections in your religion and you have protection within the civics. That's what we call a theocratical government. All right. So but the mood in 1917 and 1918 was intolerant for any nonconformity. Even recognized peace churches such as the Mennonites and the Quakers had difficulties. Um, Newer denominations without venerable traditions, not to mention sects about which the government had no reliable information, were regarded even less sympathetically, given this hostile climate and the radical bias operation of many Southern draft boards. It was also inevitable that so-called black religious objectives and their leaders would be perceived not as devout adherents to their faith, but as pawns of the German enemy or other traitors. Neither was tolerated. Southern responses to the Church of God in Christ reflected a vocal majority of the country that had no patience for anyone, whether religious, sectarian, political, dissident, or slacker who refused to demonstrate unallowed patriotism. Wartime passions inevitably led to wartime excess. Bureau of Investigation agents who were modern European male, middle class, and patriotic were not immune to intolerance. Agents assigned to Southern offices were likely to hold conventional, modern Europeans, supremacist views and grave suspicions of any so-called black nonconformity. So there you go. That's the whole thing. You got um so-called modern European supremacy, which they call themselves white, going against the real true white American citizens, which are the Aboriginal indigenous Moors. Okay, the paleo autonomous American. All right, but we have to look at certain things because it's all in the proof. Then it says years later, Elder Mason recalled his tribulations during World War One. Time had blurred the accuracy of his chronology, but not the details of his ordeals. So, in 1918, uh, I was called to appear before the judge of the Kangaroo Court in Paris. See, he already know it's a kangaroo court. It's not. It's not based in the Constitution. Okay, and that's how these people be rocking. Okay, he said, Paris, Texas. The presiding officer's SIC looked at me and laid down his books and said, "You all may try him. I will not have anything to do with him." In 1918, at Lexington, Miss, I took a scriptural stand against the ungodly deeds of the various races, about how many souls were being hurled into eternity without chance of seeking God for their soul salvation, knowing that without the hand of the Almighty there could be no remedy for the same. The Holy Ghost, through me, was teaching men to look to God, for He is their only help. I told them not to trust in the power of the United States, England, France, or Germany, but trust in God. The enemy, the devil, tried to hinder me from preaching the unadulterated word of God. He plotted against me and had the modern European so called white people to arrest me and put me in jail for several days. I thank my God for the persecution, for all that for all that live or live godly must suffer persecution. 2 Tim 3:12. Later in the same year, I was called to Jackson, Mississippi to answer to the charge that the devil had made against me. The presiding officers talked with me, after which they told me that I was backed up by the scripture and would not be hurt by them. If God be for you, who can be against you? Reasons for the federal government inability to prosecute Mason remain speculative. Perhaps the proceedings were simply dropped after the armistice on November 11, 1918, through the Justice Department, continued to pursue other wartime cases for many months. After the end of the hostilities, it is plausible that a grand jury indeed indicted Mason. Such bodies rarely fail to bring indictments. So, wartime cases for many months after the end of the hostility, it is plausible that a grand jury indeed indicted Mason. Such bodies rarely failed to bring indictments in this period, but federal attorneys, distinguishing winning from losing cases, dropped Mason's case before it came to trial. So they dropped it. Okay. Such actions were usually not recorded, and thus the absence of information in the minutes and dockets of district court is mute evidence in support of that conclusion. In any case, Mason driver Curvin and Holt were fortunate to escape having to defend themselves in the midst of a modern European so-called white populace ready to believe in the most ludicrous rumors. Okay. Many federal officials and ordinary citizens during World War One generally believed that enemies within the gates impaired the country. The notion that a sinister adversary was manipulating gullible so-called black loyalties was widely held. See, because they want you to follow them. They don't want you to be your own man. They don't want you to be um Allah inside of man or God in man. They want you to be their follower and be their flunky and be their fool and be their chattel. Okay? Can't be that. You got to be what Allah made you. And He made you in His image. Now, the Justice Department tasked with enforcement of selective service. Okay. Well, we're gonna do this. The Justice Department tasked with enforcement of selective service regulations had a legitimate interest in investigating the church and its leadership. The tragedy in this case is not the fact of federal scrutiny, but the degree to which an over energized Bureau of Investigations urged on by military intelligence compromised objectively by succumbing to popular fears and prejudices. Some agents, such as the unfortunate Dick Whitwin, conducted themselves professionally, but in this and other cases, many others imbibed the anxieties of an overwrought modern European so called white populace. The relentless pursuit of COGIC leaders and their arrest on flimsy conspiracies and impersonation charges lend credence to the elders Mason's claim to persecution. His ultimate exoneration notwithstanding, but there is likely also veiled story of resistance, although reliable COGIC membership figures for the World War One era are lacking. It is likely that hundreds, if not thousands, of members were drafted. An unknown number probably never appeared for induction. Some may have hidden out, while others sought anonymity, the anonymity of a big city, particularly in the North. Yet others undoubtedly submitted to induction even while bearing copies of the church doctrine and statement. Given the absence of the COGIC members in lists of those who became uh, absolute absolutionists, war resistors who refused to put on the uniform and were court-martialed and imprisoned. It may reasonably be assumed that the COGIC objectives, once under the Army's authority, were browbeaten or frightened into complying with military orders and shouldering a rifle. Extant records, unfortunately, do not mention such individuals. The Church of God in Christ opposition to participating in the war was both religious and political. It began from a religious conviction. Church doctrine held that Jesus taught the substitution of brotherly love for sin of hatred. The shedding of human blood or taking of human life was unequivocally wrong. On another level, however, the COGIC stance was solely political. The federal government never recognized the church's anti-war convictions as legitimate or sincere. No surprise then that it refused to grant consensuous objective status to church members. Given such opposition, it is remarkable that so-called black men, for the most part poorly educated sharecroppers and urban laborers, challenged government authority in such numbers and with a persistence not seen since the Civil War and Reconstruction era, although most of them likely submitted to the military orders. So they're giving you a sub. Most of them submitted likely because they pushed them into doing it. It's not because they wanted to do it; they forced them into doing it. Know what I mean? Now they're trying to give credence to how sneaky and how covert these people are. Now, of the objection with politically charged challenges to so-called European white authority. These associations could not go unheeded by those in government who appointed themselves grantors of modern European so-called white supremacy and the so-called black submission, persecution of church members emerged from legitimate concerns about draft evasion, but also from war-generated paranoid racism. The American public during World War I generally condoned wholesale abridgments of constitutional rights such as freedom of speech, and authority on early Pentecostal pacifism concludes that COGIC members suffer from collusion between local intolerance and war support and federal government's unyielding persecution. Ironic, Ironically, Elder Charles H. Mason's reputation would be enhanced by his travels for decades. Thereafter, he was characterized as a church leader who preserved faith and character intact in the face of persecution and prosecution. So that's what I'm talking about with the faith of the Moors. Like when you have God in you, who gonna take it out of you? Who's where you gonna fold and not stand on your square? See what I'm saying? So pacifism faded in the Church of God in Christ after World War One. Anecdotal evidence suggests that during World War II, at least some men whose membership and antedated 1941 did not fight, but how many gained recognition as conscientious objections is unknown. Only 12 members worked in civilian public service camps, so very likely their total number was small. As the COGIC membership grew rapidly during the 1950s and the 1960s, its pacifist heritage receded from view. A new generation of members performed combat duty in Vietnam. Today, church doctrine still states in the exact language of World War One era documents that the shedding of human blood or the taking of human life is contrary to the teachings of our Lord and Savior, Yahshua the Christ. And as a body, we are adverse to war in all its forms. This official statement instructs members should they be drafted to submit to induction as conscientious objections to undergo only basic training while refusing instruction in advanced weapons and to seek non-combat roles. But few members today seem to know of, much less follow that non-combatant doctrine. The early um res- restorationists, Church of God in Christ, nurtured pacifism, but as happened in other sects that grew in membership and sought to enter the denominational mainstream, consensuous opposition to war became a forgotten tradition because of the sellout. Why? Because of the 501c non-tax exempts? I guess so. It's not like how our ancestors held stuff down. Like it was just like not too many years ago, 75 years ago, something like that. Strangely, this entire historical chapter is missing from the official publications of the COGIC. The church website is entirely cited on the World War One trials and tribulations of Charles H. Mason. It serves no useful purpose to bury these events. Mason provided strong inspirational leadership under considerable duress and at times real danger. For an infant denomination, Mason's conduct and example, I thank my God for the persecution was precisely what was needed. As for the Bureau of Investigation and the Military Intelligence Division, they were ill prepared and ill equipped to understand, much less appreciate, a new move beginning to blossom in the so called Black America, which are Moors. The Great Migration offered not just the hope of new, better paying employment, but new race relations and a freer social environment. So, did they show you that yet? Did they show you all those things they just named? No, because they keep labeling us brands. um they keep killing so-called black people. They keep putting so-called tyranny on our people for being who they are. You know what I mean? And they claim their nationality and they still want to put propaganda on people. Why? Because they are living off your virtues, Morris. Period. Now, World War I further politicized so-called blacks who questioned whether a so-called white man's war, right, a modern European, was their cause too. The so-called black population, despite widespread so-called white prejudice, which are modern Europeans, they're not white, was neither gullible nor stupid. Many so-called blacks clearly knew where their self-interest lay. Okay. But government agents remain almost totally oblivious to these developments, acting instead of presuppositions and stereotypes born in the era of Nat Turner and the abolitionists. This was clearly not their finest hour. Okay. Now, you have the FBI and the Moorish Science Temple of America, 1926, 1960. Sylvester A. Johnson. Okay. This chapter briefly examines the history of the Moorish Science Temple of America, MSTA, and its interactions with the FBI as a way of introducing the FBI's now 80-year history with American Islam. Remarkably, already in the 1930s and the 1940s, long before Al Qaeda and even before the Nation of Islam, the FBI was engaged in surveillancing Muslims, and its approach was marked by a suspicious um, that yeah, the suspiciousness that anticipated its later response to certain Muslim groups in the 21st century in the case of the MSTA. This response was certainly conditioned by the racism epidemic to American society, but was also inflected by the FBI religious preconceptions and biases by what it understood as authentic religion and by how it constructed the relationship between race and religion. By tracing this history, we can see that the FBI recent approach to the threat of Islamic terrorism did not develop in a vacuum after 9/11, but reflects a more deeply rooted and institutionalized pattern of behavior that has its origins in the racial religious politics of the early 20th century. Okay. So they've been doing this. This is nothing new. They've been doing this. This is nothing new. Okay. Now, the first American Muslim to be engaged by the Bureau were members of the MSTA and Moorish American Muslim sect. The MSTA first emerged in the American Midwest as a small group under the leadership of the self-proclaimed Prophet Noble Drew Ali, born Timothy Drew, and was formally organized in 1926. But we already know that he was already in, practice in 1913. Okay, in New Jersey. All right, the Canaanite Temple. So they only want to give you parts and bits, but I'm gonna give you some more. Yeah. So the first Prophet Noble Drew Lee, born Timothy Drew, and it was formally organized in 1926. Okay, with its center in Chicago, the MSTA quickly grew to operate dozens of branches throughout the United States of America, not just the United States. Okay, they love to just put United States. That's on paper. Okay, because the prophet said that you are an American citizen, which you is a national. Okay, you're not you're a patriot here because you are the mothers and fathers of civilization, and you have treaty rights here. So why would you be a terrorist to your own land, to your own? You see what I'm saying? Your own posterity, because these people took over your land. Okay, you are the national security. All right, Islam. Now, with its center in Chicago, the MSTA quickly grew to operate dozens of branches throughout the United States, reaching a membership in the tens of thousands during the 1930s. In the wake of Drew Ali's ultimately death, he died mysteriously after being released from police custody. The MSTA split into multiple fractions, while maintaining a mainstream center that easily outnumbered the others. Official membership numbers are not available, but as at its height, the movement had upward of 30,000 registered members with an undetermined number of informal adherents. What? So they had informers in the movement. Origins of the Moorish Science Temple. The MSTA emergence as an Islamic revivalist movement resulted from a complex history of the Muslim transnationalism, vigorously abetted by efforts to critique and resist Western imperialism and predominantly Muslim geographies. Prominent among these was the rise of the Egyptian nationalism and the deliberate efforts to preserve Islamic education in West Africa. For example, in present day Nigeria, amid sustained efforts by Western Christian missionaries to make Christian conversions an essential qualification for civic and institutional participation. So why you got to try to make me Christian to learn civics? No, no, no. My religion is Islam, which is protected up under the Constitution with the treaty rights that the Sultan of Muhammad and all my other ancestors had set in place here in this damn land. Now, Islamic Africa was not the only source of the ideas that shaped the MSTA of special importance, as well as the Al Mahdiya mission, which emerged in South Asia during the 1880s under the leadership of Mizram Ghulam Ahmad. Ahmad created a revolutionist revivalist movement among Muslims by preaching that a promised messenger, the Mahdi, would appear to restore faithful adherence to the divine message of Islam. Ahmadi Muslims drew on a tradition of Mahdi theology that dated back to the 10th century, if not before, and that inspired hope in a special divinely appointed messenger. Not surprisingly, Ahmadis also reflected the influence of South Asia, convincia of multiple religions shaped by many centuries of relative harmony among Muslims and Hindus, and a growing Christian presence. Ahmadi missionaries rooted their theology in Quranic scriptures, but also drew on the scriptures of Hindus and Christians. What held all these influences together was the belief that the Mahdi fulfilled the expectations and essential messages of the world's many religions with the purity and the uprightness, not perverse dogma. Shortly following the end of the World War, Ahmadis opened a mission site in Chicago where they quickly attached a following among so-called blacks who admired the movement critique of racism and its emphasis on interracial harmony, which the Ahmadis foregrounded, although this exists no clear evidence that Drew Ali was tied to the Ahmadis because he wasn't. You know what I mean? Or he was. Hmm. Because those teachers was out there. So some of these people took these teachings because see, look, tell you about what the FBI do. Okay, they'll put it out there, but they ain't gonna tell you directly because then they're giving too much information of their incongruent crimes. Okay, now he and his followers were likely influenced by the movement's efforts to promote Islam as a harbinger of racial harmony in a world marked by strident disparity and injustice, as is evident from the Moorish Science Temple science of spiritual knowledge, numerology, esotericism, Freemasonry also influenced the MSCA's belief system and ethos, right? Since taking shape in Europe during the 18th century, Freemasonry has long made science central to itself um, representation, as Michael Gomez has emphasized. However, this does not diminish the significance of the Islamic heritage of the Moorish American Muslims, which is richly attested throughout so called slavery and up to the early 20th century. While its intellectual genealogy goes back to many sources, the Moorish Science Temple is appropriately situated as part of this larger history for Moors and Islam. The Moorish Science Temple officially dates the beginning to 1913, when Noble Drew Ali putatively found a Canaanite temple in Newark, New Jersey. Little hard evidence illuminates or illumines the life of his organization at this point in its history. What is certain is that by the mid 1920s, Drew Ali's movement had developed enough of a following for a process of institutional nationalization to occur, with founding members registering the new religious group of November 29th. So the feds is telling you that Drew Ali was nationalizing Moors. He wasn't doing no naturalization. So a lot of these grand sheiks and these temples have to answer, why are they naturalizing Moors into the United States corporation as corporate entities? Show me in your bylaws where that is applicable, and why are you using part and partial when it is part and parcel? Hmm? I would like to know. I like to know. So, Drew Ali's movement had developed enough of a following for a process of, well, institutionalization to occur, with founding members registering the new religious group on November 29th, 1926 as the Moorish Temple of Science. Not until May 21st, 1928, however, did they officially change the name to the Moorish Science Temple of America. The initial moniker more clearly emphasized that scientific knowledge, a science of spirituality, numerology, and the like, was integral to the theology and ethos of this Islamic community. The second permanent name retained the reference to spiritual science, but also signaled the group's efforts to identify with USA nationalism, efforts that in turn sought to promote the rights of citizenship for Moors. The larger context in which the MSTA thrived was marked by numerous Moors political movements that criticized modern European white racism, while promoting reforms to achieve racial equality and Moors' political empowerment. Among these were the Universal so-called Negro Improvement Association, founded by the married couple Army Garvey and Marcus Garvey; the Peace Movement of Ethiopia; the Ethiopian World Federation Council; and the Pacific Movement of the Eastern World. It was not uncommon for members of the Moorish Science Temple to affiliate with these other organizations, particularly the Garvey Movement and the Garveys. Distinct view of race and politics is mirrored in the MSTA's theology diaspora. Okay, that's why Marcus Garvey is the forerunner. He told you about your nationality. Okay, but nobody want to talk about that. All right. Now, identity, for instance, was central to the MSTA's claim of Moorish identity by conceptualizing the Moorish religion as encompassing a range of non-European races united by the experience of racism and colonialism. Converts to more science develop a sense of national identity marked by political membership in a diasporic community. For them, Islam was not so much a confession of faith as a kind of citizenship in a racially defined civilization that spanned the globe. The political community of Asiatic peoples, as conceived through religious formations of Moorish networks, is emblematic of what J. Loran Mattery has theorized as a non-territorial formation of the nation. What the Moorish Science Temple added to this critique of colonialism and racism was an embrace of United States of American nationalism, the belief that Moorish Americans should seek and enjoy membership in the political body of the United States of America from the very beginning of Drew Ali's leadership, and continuing through a steady tradition of teaching. The MSTA enjoyed obedience to government authorities and insisted that converts exhibited loyalty to both their religious community and the United States of America. Beginnings of federal repression. J. Edgar Hoover was first alerted to the Moorish Science Temple status as a threat by a report from Philadelphia FBI field office, which presented findings from his covert observations of the group. Thus, from the beginning, Hoover associated these Moorish American Muslims with racial insurgents. In 1931, During the early phase of the FBI's covert surveillance, a field agent interviewed under false pretense J.T. Bay, and Moorish American barber who led the MSTA membership in Reading, Pennsylvania. The agent had already questioned Bay's landlord, a woman who rented to Moorish American boarders. Bay innocently enough informed the undercover agent of the movement's proper name. The FBI had referred to it as the Moorish Shrine Temple and explained the fundamental aim of members' faith recovering their Moorish heritage. As Bay made clear, the MSCA, from its membership cards to its organizational practices, rejected the ideology of modern European white supremacy and taught instead that Moorish peoples merited treatment on the basis of racial equality. Accordingly, converts were told that displaying their membership cards at local restaurants would ensure they receive every courtesy and equal privilege with other races. Upon learning this, the FBI concluded that Bay was a fanatic on the subject of equality for all races. Strikingly, the FBI demised the belief system of the group as the result of mental imbalance and delusion. Bureau officials were quick to note that reliable Moors, reliable so-called Negroes not affiliated with the MSTA regarded the Moorish group to be crazy and more or less of a joke. So this is what they have our people realizing about their own selves. They got our people mindset, okay, outside of themselves because they think that they're not from here. They think that they are Indian. They think that they was took from Africa when Africa is really right here. This is North America. This is North Africa. This is the North Gate. This is North America. Okay. This is Morocco. Al Marak. Okay. So when they talk all this bull crap, when you understand anthropology and you understand it shifts up under the crescent, the cuffs up under the land and shift the land and separated certain continents, that's why certain things are not, the same in that broad of an aspect. They changed your history, they changed the maps, they changed geo political locations that Moors already had in effect. But you treasonous Moors out here that know the truth are still standing on this pseudo corporation. You see what I'm saying? Now, the FBI's response to the anti-racist theology of the MSTA exposes the assertive commitment to anti so-called black racism that the Department of Justice manifested in this period, in as much as the MSTA opposed modern European white supremacy and opposed the legal practice of apartheid throughout American society. The FBI was technically correct in identifying the group as opposed to the nation's standard practice of political order. In this sense, the movement was literally subversive of the social order that the FBI was seeking to defend. The FBI racist presumption that modern European whites were inherently superior to blacks led them to dismiss the MSTA's self understanding as Moors. See? So just for their biases and their racist attitudes and their indoctrination of thinking that they are the rulers and they are the Americans and they are the white people, they're gonna dismiss your claim, but it's in fact and it's in law and it's in history that you can enforce, and that's why our prophet came to us so he can teach us these principles. Okay, Morris? So when they try to talk these crazy things, here we go. We got backup. Now, whew, the claim to be a Muslim was a ruse, a fake identity that used, right? Was wait a minute, was racial. They were Moors defined by the appearance and characteristics of a full-blooded so-called Negro. So that's why they wanted to, because they already put this brand on you. But nah, they know some people, some Moors that modern Europeans that are Masons, they know you're Moors, and they still use that because they are racist, and they got to keep their secret. They got to keep you subjugated. Okay, so that is the national security.
Understand that. So they'll have people at the top that know you more, and they'll use dummies, unprofessional, unskilled on religion, unskilled on nationality, and that's not and nationality and race. They don't understand these certain things, so they'll go in willingly, ignorantly, and wound and hurt Moors, which is unconstitutional, which they can be left out of here for war crimes, and their mandate can be revoked at any time. Now, for the FBI, their true identity was racial. They were so called black, defined by the appearance and characteristics of a full blooded so called Negro. Their claim to be Muslim was a ruse, a fake identity that used religion to perpetuate a fraud. This is what these people want to put forth on Moors to perpetuate what fraud? You guys in this corporation are perpetuating a fraud, okay? And naming our Moors, our Moorish people, black people. That's perpetuating the fraud. Now, now they claim to be a Muslim was a ruse, a fake identity that used religion to perpetuate a fraud. The MSTA assertion of ethnic heritage thus function as evidence for the FBI that these Moorish Americans were engaged in religious deception, which is a lie. And according with the understanding of the MSTA, the FBI coordinated with state and local law enforcement to harass and intimidate MSTA leaders, notwithstanding the fact that they were engaged in legal and constitutionally protected activities. Now, now, who's violating the Constitution? That's an easy question. Who's violating the Constitution? The FBI is. These policy enforcers are. These CI agents are. But you want to keep me from my rights, so I got to be in subjective to be a criminal in my own land, just like you. You want followers of you. That's why you do the things you do. Now, in accordance with the understanding of the MSTA, the FBI coordinate with the state and local law enforcement to harass and intimidate MSTA leaders, notwithstanding the fact that they were engaged in legal constitutional protected activities. Yes, they was engaged. That's for the second time. By 1941, the FBI's infiltration of the MSTA in Springfield, Illinois, for instance, led the Bureau to focus on Robert Washington, who headed a local branch of the group. Washington claimed that a Japanese victory against the United States corporation would bring an end to U.S. racism because the Japanese were an Afro Asiatic people. Recall that the MSCA espoused the idea of global unity among peoples of Moorish ancestry in opposition to the Western colonialism and racism. The Bureau lacked any legal justification for prosecuting Washington, who had no connection with Japan and received no foreign material support. The FBI's own investigation confirmed that he derived his income from selling badges and robes to new converts in the MSTA. Yet the Bureau coordinated with the Illinois State Attorney General office to intimidate Washington into silence by telling him he would be prosecuted by the U.S. corporation for obtaining money under fake pretenses. Unnerved by the threat, Washington agreed to stop seeking converts in exchange for avoiding imprisonment, sufficiency, and racial suspension. The MSCA's efforts to create a reliable, independent system of financial self support culminated in 1939 with the acquisition of 138 acres of land in Prince George County, Virginia. Right? The and the Virginia property also functioned. Wait a minute. I'm reading too fast. Okay. um, George County, Virginia, they're members of the group created what they called a national home that provided an economic base for crop production and commerce. They later created similar settlements in Beckett, Massachusetts, and Woodstock, Connecticut. The Virginia property also functioned as a resting place or resort for MSTA members who initially envisioned it as a retirement facility for elderly Moorish Americans. At first, several dozen residents moved to the farm. Their numbers increased to approximately 75 men and women. By 1942, and the National Network of Temples provided regular donations to support the Virginia property. Fred Nelson Bay was the initial leader of the home. Born in North Carolina in 1890, Nelson Bay was a seasoned devotee of the MSTA and proved to be a visionary and judicious administrator. He oversaw the construction of the first building, one major temple, and three or four other concrete block buildings. In addition to these, residents built a few log cabins insulated with mud in the early years of the national home. However, simple tents were the most common shelters. Central to the most science temple brought a sense of connection was the national home production of the Moorish Voice, edited by Nelson Bay's wife. She produced a monthly issue and mailed 500 copies of the um, periodical to the various branches of the MSTA throughout the country. The publication was essential to the movement's unity and dissemination. By 1942, the FBI surveillance and infiltration of the Moorish Americans temple, right? Moorish Science Temple, because they're telling you right here, it was infiltrated. So if the Moorish Science Temples was infiltrated by the FBI, do you think that what these grand sheiks are teaching now and what's they coming out of their mouth in these temples are absolutely correct on the force? That's why we're not getting any um justice in these people's venues that um they claiming to put propaganda and calling us sovereign citizens in. And then a lot of our Moors are hard-headed. They don't want to study. You see what I'm saying? And then you have all these other Moors that's out here putting out false information, and they pick up the wrong information because they're not studying. So we have to understand certain things that has been already put forth and already in plagued our people's mindset and their understanding to comprehend certain things. Now, by 1942, FBI surveillance and infiltration of the Moorish American had increased sharply. Field office agents in cities such as Detroit and Chicago displayed a stringently suspicious disposition toward the MSTA. By contrast, law enforcement officials in Virginia initially took a less suspicious approach to MSTA members of the national home. Much of this was due to the disarming, right? To the disarming forthcoming methods that Nelson Bay used to engage with local police and the FBI agents who visited their farm. Upon the arrival, residents of the national home had been treated by local law enforcement as criminal suspects. In fact, the Prince George County Sheriff's Office claimed a spat on robberies had occurred in the region and arrived on location in 1942 to question Nelson Bay as soon as the compound was established, suggesting residents must have been involved because the robberies had begun at the time of their arrival. Nelson Bay informed the sheriff that they were a religious community whose only concern was justice and ethics, and he further assumed the sheriff by declaring that he should feel free to inspect their homes and other buildings at any time with no warrant necessary. An initial inspection, not surprisingly, showed that the group had not stolen any property and that members were committed to maintaining a rugged and honest existence through their own labor with financial assistance from the MSTA national headquarters. Nelson Bay also reassured local authorities by taking in an individual placed on probation by the local court system by the account of Circuit Court Judge Frank Bilford. Nelson Bay not only kept the judge informed of the individual's behavior, but eventually reported that the man was violating probation, turning him over to the court authorities who returned him to jail by cooperating with local, modern, racist, so called white political officials In these ways, the MSTA community leader won a measure of trust amongst them because that's why they infiltrated. They wanted to, get good so-called Negro Moors minded because your constitution protects all that. They're not supposed to just why are you giving up your constitutional rights to these foreigners to come search your your abode. You're sovereign, right? See, this is where the infiltration started coming into play. But Moors don't get it. Moors don't get it. Okay? Now, upon the arrival in Louisville, Moorish Science Temple around 1941, and then you have to understand you had the MSTA by cooperating with local officials, ways the MSTA community leader won a measure of trust essential to mitigating the police harassment, abuse, and social control to which so-called blacks, which they calling them blacks now. What happened to Moors, right? Which Moors were routinely subjected. So now they're trying to bring them up under their jurisdiction still when they had their own jurisdiction, Moors. Don't you see the hypocrisy in that? Subsequent leaders of the MSTA National Home included Mary Cliff Bay, who held extensive experience as the Grand Sheikah's temple leader of Louisville, Kentucky. For several years, she skillfully led the Prince George County group and ensured its stability while parrying suspicions of and harassment by FBI and police officials. It so happens that Cliff Bay original encounters with the FBI began long before the assumed leadership of the MSTA National Home. Born in Tennessee, she had eventually moved to Chicago, where she felt joined the Moorish Science Temple around 1941. She moved to Louisville, Kentucky, while she worked as a teacher. Upon her arrival in Louisville, Mary Cliff Bay, opened a new temple that soon grew to at least 50 members. As the temple's grand sheikah, she communicated directly with Charles Kirkman Bay. Hmm, dirty more. So we got to understand what's going on. Kirkman Bay was mad because the prophet left Emily L, the Grand Sheik, the Supreme Grand Sheik title. He wanted. But what's she meeting with him for? The MSTA's national leader. See, now he made himself a national leader. And she coordinated with other temple leaders to promote Moors' conversion to Islam. So so-called black people conversion to Islam, right? The Louisville field office of the FBI began investigating um, Mary Cliff Bay as soon as it learned of her activities. Bureau agents initially suspected that she and her followers were affiliated with the neighboring St. Mary's Church. In fact, the FBI initiated suspected that the church was merely a front for the Moorish Science Temple, following reports by casual observers who took notice of elaborate Moorish costumes the church practitioners wore, wore during their meetings. They quickly summarized, however, that Mary Clifton Bay was operating a temple under her own leadership, as was routinely the case with the MSTA members. The FBI was immediately alarmed that the Louisville followers of Moorish science identified themselves as Asiatics. They're not because they don't want to be black. So Mary already stayed true to the principles of her congregation being Asiatics and not being the term black. Now let's keep reading. Refused to use what they call slave names and insisted that their actual Moorish names be indicated with the suffix Bay or L. When registering to vote or when registering under the Selective Service Act, city officials eventually forced the MSTA members to register using objectionable names that that European, right? European, modern European, so-called white slave owners, right? Use their scraw name, not they L and Bay suffix, okay? Had forced on their ancestors, though this happened only after some legal and political wrangling. See, the feds is telling you. Whereas The FBI earlier investigation of the MSTA was limited to its members. The Bureau's Louisville field office escalated its scrutiny of the city's Moorish American Muslims by conducting a master survey of Louisville predominantly Moorish neighborhoods, understanding that MSTA members constantly employed the use of Moorish names for conducting business and acquiring housing. The FBI arranged for the local air raid warden to conduct a house by house search and census of Moorish American residents to produce a list of every Moor Muslim living in the area because they needed to put a cap on this. They wanted to control this. Okay? Because, okay, for instance, I come in the Moorish Science Temple and I started to do my own thing. Now, because I'm going with the principles and I'm trying to give my people what the prophet teachings is really about. And now here come the damn feds. They've been doing this and they've been breaking the law. They've been breaking the constitutional oath that they're supposed to have for the United States of America Constitution, not just from the United States. Because yeah, you adopted the Constitution from us, but you took it and you inherited a immigration act. But where's the nationality act that was put forth first? Now, so American Muslims, by conducting a massive survey, predominantly Moorish neighborhoods, understanding the MSTA members, consistently employed the use of Moorish names for conducting business and acquiring housing. The FBI arranged for the local air and warden to conduct a house by house search and census of Moorish American residents to produce a list of every Moorish or every Moor Muslim living in the area. National security and the military draft. Now, here we go again. Here we go again. Here we go again with national security and the military draft. That's Moors are exempt. Moors are tax exempt. Moors are military exempt. We're not supposed to be fighting their wars at all, unless we see the cause that is likely something that is gonna, you know, bring forth tyranny towards us in a way that, you know what I mean. No, we're not gonna be a part of that unless it's domestically something that we have to defend, especially up under their rule. That's what the Constitution protected you from. Now, the most severe FBI repression of the Moorish Science Temple emerged during World War II as a consequence of the Selective Service Act. As early as the summer of 1942, the Military Intelligence Division of the U.S. War Department became interested in the MSTA when members of the religious community protested being classified as Negroes or blacks during the interviews with local Selective Service registration officials. See, see, now what y'all protesting be that y'all ain't supposed to be doing that. Why y'all doing that? Oh, because another Moor came in with their eyes open and their ears to hear and stood on their square. Okay. The Army's military intelligence division, in fact, communicated directly with J. Edgar Hoover to inform him of these encounters with more Muslims. Given the racism evident in the FBI's early response to the MSTA, it should be noted that the FBI field officers went on record confirming that various branches of the MSTA conform to the Selective Service Act (SSA) and showed no evidence of being a national security threat. A critical mass of MSTA members did refuse to register with the Selective Service, as federal investigators found in Kansas, for instance, during 1942. But when FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover instructed agents throughout the country to investigate and infiltrate a number of MSTA branches, the Bureau's field officers repeatedly found that members of the movement were largely conforming to the SSA mandate. The Newark, New Jersey office reported in December 1942 that members of the Moorish Science Temple in the city showed no indication of failure to register for the draft. See, That's why they infiltrated the temples, because they don't need you standing on your square. They need you to be docile. They need you to be naturalized into a United States corporation entity, damn debt slave. And as long as you're doing that for master, yes, you're a good master. You're a good Negro, but you're not that. They made you believe that you are that. They indoctrinated you in their school system and made you believe that you are that. So that's why any more that is righteously putting the truth out, they're gonna violate the oath of the Constitution to protect those secured rights by the indigenous Moors here, or they're gonna, because they coop the system to make the system do what it's doing now. So what they look like trying to uh, let Moors have real liberation in their own land. Now, the MSTA branches, the Bureau's field officers repeatedly found that members of the movement were largely conforming to the SSA mandate. The Newark, New Jersey office reported in December 1942 that members of the Moorish Science Temple in the city showed no indication of failure to register, because that was their whole plan for the draft. Likewise, during the same month, other FBI agents judged the Fleeting group of approximately 12 Moorish Americans in Anderson, Indiana, to be free of any pro Japanese tendencies. Even the much larger MSTA membership in Louisville, Kentucky, eventually passed muster under FBI infiltration and surveillance. The only irregularity the agents found, in fact, was the failure of some members to update changes of address with their local draft board registration office, because they had to go in and flip everything around and make sure everything was all the temples were applying by the FBI un unlawful prude of Moorish rights. FBI officials in other regions, however, often came to less being conclusions, wreaking havoc on local MSCA temples. During 1942, several Moorish Americans in Mississippi were prosecuted because they didn't go with the bull crap. So they're going to prosecute those faithful Moors, and then they're going to let the sellout Moors do their thing. That's why they had their little Wakandas and not wearing their feathers out in public, but only, wearing them inside the temple like they lodges, because it was Masons that took them over, Shriner Masons that took them over. They took over the real red and blue lodges. You see what I'm saying? That already was there to protect against all this fucking folly. But you know, that's when more is supposed to come into their own, have their own schools, and have all this to their own. But they infiltrated those through the FBI and the CIA and J. Edgar Hoover. Now, 1942, after paying the registration fee of $1.25 and monthly dues of 75 cents. This conferred rights of membership as well as a $60 burial insurance policy, 900 in today's dollars. One prospective convert reported that MSTA members claimed that those converting to the Moorish Science Temple would be exempt from the military draft. In the eyes of Mississippi FBI field agents, however, these MSTA members were not a religious community but a rebel group of racial enemies threatening the ability of the modern European so called white race to control the government of Mississippi and that of the nation. Once convicted, the MSTA members, all men, were sentenced to jail time, an example to any other so called black who might be inspired to challenge the brutal hegemony that modern European so called whites waged over the lives of so called black people that are Moors. Because now they then took you out of your nationalization, they subjugated you into naturalization. Now they got the authority to subjugate you. Now, those Moors who stood on the national principles, they couldn't do them like that. Okay? Even the even the so-called black Muslims of Anderson, Indiana, a group later shown by the FBI's own investigation to have no pro-Japanese sympathy. So these were Moors. These was Moors, okay? But they calling them black now because they infiltrated the temple, okay? Now, we're subject to punitive measures before reaching its conclusion that the MSTA branch evidence no threat to national security, the Bureau raided the Anderson MTA temple, seized its possessions, and closed its operations. What had been a small but thriving branch of 60 to 70 members eventually reopened, but with only about a dozen members, who were understandably traumatized by the brazen, counterintelligent methods that threatened them as presumptive criminals. The MSTA during the Civil Rights era, the 1950s and the 1960s, witnessed the emergence of a wide spectrum of activists, movements, or organizations that achieved major changes in the racial status. Quote, veteran organizations such as the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, right? That's why all this was pushed, because most of the stuff, the infiltration within the temples was already met. So there were more still trying to push equality the when the temples was, I mean, well, really infiltrated. So the NAACP, founded in 1909, and the Congress of Racial Equality, founded in 1942, found new company with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, founded in 1955, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, founded in concert, right? So, so of these, only SCCLs was an explicitly religious organization with SCLC's entry. However, so-called black churches began an unprecedented level of activism in concert with the NAACP, core SNCC, and other organizations. By 1960s, moreover, the Nation of Islam, NOI, had risen to public visibility, especially as the press began to focus attention on NOI Chief Minister El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, better known to the Negroes, so called Negroes, as Malcolm X. But that more changed his appellation and title before he transcended, because he knew he was a Moor. He knew he was a Moorish American. Okay? Now, and his criticism of the global, modern, European, so called white supremacism, colonialism, and the criminalization of self defense among victims of anti so called black violence, which we know is more violence, although there were important differences of philosophy and practices. The NOI shared with the MST a theological critique of modern European white supremacism and a central emphasis of diasporic identity as part of the Asiatic races. Both also promoted conversion to Islam as a way to ameliorate the racial subjugation of so called blacks in the United States. But one of them knew about their nationality and sold out, and that was Elijah Poole Bey, known as Elijah Muhammad. Then you had Wally Ford L., known as Master Farad, that was up under the illustrious noble prophet. Now, although there were important differences of philosophy and practice, the NOI shared with the MSTA a theological critique of modern European white supremacism and central emphasis on diasporic identity as part of the Asiatic race. Both also promoted conversion to Islam as way of to ameliorate the racial subjugation of Moors in the United States of America. The convergence of secular and religious Moorish organizations produced an array of Moorish liberationist projects, unprecedented and profound in their resistance and impact. And this broader context injected a new sense of urgency into the FBI engagement with the MSTA. One Moorish American leader in particular, Turner L., captured the attention of the FBI during the 1950s by expressing an intense in civil rights activism. In the spring of 1956, Turner L. resolved to host a conference in Norfolk, Connecticut, to address the desperate conditions of Moorish migrants from the South, people who had been driven to resettle in northern cities to escape the dire poverty of sharecropping and the willful denial of employment opportunities by modern European so-called whites, drawing on the MSTA long time identification with Morocco as a paradigmic Islamic state. The Moorish devotee publicized a meeting sponsored by the Moroccan Executive Congress, which was intended to serve as one element of a larger Moroccan unit, United Organization Federation Inc. MUOF. Since at least 1950, the U.S. Army Military Intelligence Unit had been made aware that a smaller offshoot of the MSCA, the Moorish Science Temple Divine National Movement of America, had organized the MUOF with Turner L. at the helm, because Turner L. claimed that he would meet with the DOJ's chief of civil rights, Arthur Caldwell, at the time. During the planned conference, it appeared to the FBI that the Moorish organization might instigate political unrest and trouble, and at a higher volatile time, just after the U.S. Supreme Court Brown versus Board of Education decision 1954 had ruled against legal segregation in public schools, and in the midst of an ongoing boycott of Montgomery's public transit system and a related legal suit being appealed to the Supreme Court, the MUOF had made clear its conviction that the U.S. government needed to protect and defend the human rights of all Moorish Americans, and that refusal to do so would require the MUOF to repatriate all Moorish Americans who are suffering as slaves under their southern tyrannical um corporate entity legal ingus would be nationalized. Okay. The FBI responded to the MSTA efforts to advance civil rights with a campaign of infiltration, intimidation, and racial panic mongering, despite MSTA's officials' ample justification for opposing state based racism and for demanding an ethical, just response from the U.S. government. The FBI interpreted their efforts to advance racial equality as a threat to the domestic order and moved against the MSTA as if it were a danger to the national security, because that is their national security. It is a danger to the United States corporation, because then they will not be able to legislate as the white power here, which they're not. They're not white people. They are colored people. They are black people. But we nationalized them through the National Nation Act that was forced uh, upon all pale skinned nations. Okay. And through that period in time, they took away our national principles through their what? Through their corporate government, okay? And set up their government to combat ours in our own land, forcing us into prison and convictions and felonies and criminal lifestyle through propaganda, took over hip hop, all type of things to keep your mind and keep your intelligence at bay. Now obey and do your history. Now conclusion. Accounting for the FBI repression of the Moorish Science Temple raises the perplexing question of why state authorities persisted decade after decade in disrupting a religious movement that explicitly embraced and promoted U.S. nationalism, right? Because it's the USA supposed to be nationalism. Hmm? But why you then promote nationalism for the Moors? Why did you take that from the Moors? The group claimed to process an Islamic ethnic heritage while teaching that members' Moorish nationality, that is, their membership in a Muslim diaspora, would garner respect from modern European whites and facilitate their inclusion in the body politic of the United States of America. In retrospect, it is evident that the vast majority of these Moorish American Muslims adhere to the mandates of U.S. draft laws, okay, because they were infiltrated. Those temples there. Now, We know this because the FBI official repeatedly found and reported it that they were abiding by their construct. It is also clear that, contrary to initial conjecture by federal agents, the Moorish Science Temple was never a front for foreign entities and never received funding from international enemies of the United States of America. Again, the FBI owns records firmly establishing this. So why are you terrorizing people? Hmm? Even the fact that the MSCA members were Moors does not by itself account for the FBI response. Anti Moorish racism was certainly endemic to FBI culture in this period, but the Bureau lacked the resources to infiltrate the repress and every so-called black movement on an ongoing basis. Why then did the FBI focus so much attention on the MCA? See, they gotta shut that down. Keep you Negroes, keep you colored, keep you African Americans. That's why they gotta keep you. They gotta keep you their brains. They gotta keep you their legal ingus. They gotta keep you civil letter martus, my friend. Get your nationality. Now, even the fact that the MSCA members were Moors does not by itself account for the FBI response. Anti so called black racism was certainly epidemic to FBI culture in this period, but the Bureau lacked the resources to infiltrate and repress every so called black movement on an ongoing basis. Why then did the FBI focus so much attention on the MSCA and single it out for surveillance and persecution over such a long period? Cultivating confidential informants, planting undercover spies within the movement, coordinating extensive alliances with municipal law enforcement agencies, and deploying deliberating tactics of intimidation and prosecution in an effort to disrupt and cripple the group's institutional life. A more precise explanation for the repression must begin with the intersection between the national security paradigm and the tactics of identifying racial enemies in wartime. The FBI information during the early 20th century anchored a larger process of establishing counterintelligence as a central mechanism of governance. Counterintelligence, furthermore, was concerned with identifying and disrupting not criminals per se, but political enemies of the state. Because this was not a criminal status, it should come as no surprise that the Moorish American Muslims who were the victims of state repression were typically innocent of crimes. In a political sense, they were racial enemies and not criminals. The Islamic Asiatic nature of the diaspora that Moorish Americans signified was inevitably in conflict with the imperatives of racial so called whiteness. Under these conditions, Moorish Americans were asserting an ethnic heritage that conflicted sharply with the symbolic and material realities of the United States as a racial, so called modern European supremacist of a corporation that is foreign to the Aboriginal, Indigenous, Autochthonous Moors, Asiatics that are here, that they are putting on paper saying that this is their land, when in actuality it's not. This is under apparatus of the state. J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI in the religious Cold War, Diane Kirby. Although the Cold War has long been remembered as secular conflict, a number of scholars since 2000 have argued that religion played an important role in how it unfolded, shaping its nature. Okay, its conduct and the rhetoric used to frame and justify it. Understand the role of religion in this conflict provides critical insights into domestic repercussions of a struggle in which each side proclaimed universal values. Such religious legitimation and privilege those religions, groups, and institutions that supported the state over those that criticized it. A striking characteristic of East-West Cold War rivalry was that it was fought on two fronts, not just abroad, but also at home. On the domestic front, in each of the two blocks, as fried Holiday has observed, there was repression of those two blocks. As Fred Holiday has observed, there was a repression of those suspecting of sympathies for the other side, persecution of terrorists in Eastern Europe, McCarthyism in the USA. The effort to suppress internal dissent took different forms in each bloc. And in the West, it was particularly evident in the United States, the leader of the free world, with the FBI playing a central role. Hoover FBI was well armed to confront and any hint of radicalism or dissent from the domestic discipline and Cold War conformity that the Bureau was enlisted to impose. By 1946, the FBI employed more than 3,000 agents, was endowed with presidential sanction to engage in wiretapping and other forms of surveillance, and enjoyed a seemingly unlimited budget along with widespread public support, including that of most American clergy. This chapter surveys the role of religion in the FBI's effort to prevail in the Cold War, its recruitment of religious allies. That's why you got the Pope and you got Washington D.C. You see what I'm saying? The three tier corporation with the Vatican. You know what I mean? With the Pope. See what I'm saying? Then you got Washington D.C., District of Columbia. Okay. Now, and it also touches on the FBI impact on the development of organized American religious life during and in the wake of the Cold War. Religion and Cold War. Well before the Cold War, Marxist atheism, justified as abolitionist brand of anti-communist that by claiming to be a defender of religion recruited a range of powerful potential allies among religious institutions and organizations. Hoover was a leading promoter of this strain of abolitionist anti-communism, using his influence to advance the perception of communism as a supreme and unqualified evil seeking world domination, which was all propaganda. He was helped by key church leaders, particularly from within the U.S. Roman Catholic Church, as has been well documented. The Cold War facilitated the widespread acceptance of abolitionist anti-communism, which invoked religion as a way of imposing political, social, and moral conformity. The emergence of the Soviet Union as a major power in the post-war world posed a serious challenge to both the capitalist powers and organized religion, and that threat was seen as an insidious one, coming from within as well as from without. From its earlier days, the FBI identified internal dissent, whether from revolutionary radicals or from advocates of reform with the Soviet Union. The emergence of the Cold War meant that a range of dissenters, could be identified as traitors, um, subversives who were unpatriotic, immoral, and godless allies, if not agents of an enemy committed to the destruction both of the American way of life and of religion, which is all lies, which is all de facto, which is all null and void. But they have the apparatus to enforce their um tyrannic powers. The religious Cold War took a variety of forms and was not unique to the United States either, in deploying security forces to monitor religious critics of the status quo or in seeking religious allies to help maintain it. In Nazi propaganda against the Allies, Hitler, who had proclaimed his invasion of the Soviet Union, a crusade against the atheist Bolsheviks, fully exploited the Soviet record and religion, allied with the Soviet Union during World War II. However, Britain and the United States had reasons to avoid dwelling on the anti religious character of maxims, and in fact, Christianity served as a bridge between the West and the communist East. The post war effort to cast the Soviets as the enemy of religion was not simply a return to a well-established war tradition, because they didn't want to. Always made the Russians enemies because they knew who you were. They knew that you was the high priest of Anu. They knew that um you was Yahshua and stuff. They knew your bloodline, and they couldn't have that influence around they good damn slaves, right? So that's why they put up all these interrogations, sneak covert operations. Okay, now signaling to the American people and those elsewhere that the wartime allegiance was over. The United States had emerged from the war divided not simply over what its global role should be, but also over whether it should even have a global role. Those who championed an active global role were inclined to emphasize the Soviet threat to the world in an effort to persuade the American people to support the interventionism required for their country's continued economic well being. This included President Truman, who called on a righteous nation narrative to engender national unity, drawing on the notion of divine chosenness that has been a part of American self-representation since its colonial beginnings. So they are allied with their European nations that are keeping the Moors are enslaved. That's what all they're doing, and they warn against the ones who want to liberate Moors. That's all they're doing. This is what your so-called government is doing. This is what they're doing. Now, Truman, who called on a righteous nation narrative to engender national unity, drawing on the notion of divine um, choosiness that has been a part of America's self-representation since its colonial beginnings. The president rhetoric was infused with religious language that reinforced the image of a righteous nation with a God-given mission. This rhetoric was part of what allowed the Truman administration to justify a costly policy of military, political, and economic intervention on a worldwide scale. David Caught, the distinguished historian of American post-war Red Scare, remarked that through the careful, constructed Truman Doctrine, the president inflamed the natural missionary piety of Americans. Bernard Bach called, noted, likewise described it as a tantamount to a declaration of an ideological or religious war. This effort to develop a religious mission for post war America was echoed by Hoover, who, like one of the era's most notorious figures, Senator Joseph McCarthy, cast himself as a defender of Christianity against communist atheism, which they was the communist atheism. They wasn't real Christians. They used it as a guise. They used it as a facade. These people are not righteous. They are devils in the flesh. Fears that the nation might slip back into depression, which had tested and threatened American capitalism, um, permeated the thinking of U.S. leaders in a variety of key institutions. And economic crisis had demonstrated the need to remain engaged with the world and to spread free market ideology. However, the latter was not necessarily the most appealing model to colonial peoples throughout the global south who aspired to higher standards of living, free from the shackles of Western imperialism and foreign exploitation of their natural resources. The demise and discrediting of fascism meant even Europeans were inclining more towards social democracy than toward America's capitalist model. In addition, the Red Army's courage, the immense Soviet wartime losses, and the significant shift in the position of religion had helped transform Soviet standing on the world stage. So that's when Moors try to do anything. They try to go into the democracy to take over that so they can legislate through that. But you can't do that because that was their stuff. You always been republic. Okay? It's no it's no democracy in the Constitution. So threatened by the ascendancy of a rival to a capitalism, many leaders from American industries, businesses, media churches, and government concluded that religious faith was one of the most potent arrows in the quiver of domestic security. Together, they constructed what Jonathan Herzog has termed the spiritual industrial complex, which he defines as the deliberate and managed use of societal resources to stimulate a religious rival in the late 1940s and 1950s. Herzog placed Hoover at the heart of this complex, contending that fewer Americans brought it more about the dangers of domestic communism and fewer benefited more from the fears they helped create. A prolific writer and speaker who enjoyed a reputation as America's most respected authority on communism, Hoover turned the FBI into an effective anti-communist propaganda tool. So this is a, a communist propaganda tool, which communism is all made up, bought by the United States corporation, okay, and exercised to the fullest with racism intact. You see what I'm saying? Because it's not a race. It's what they're doing is enforcing the apparatus and power that they hold, and they doing this through war crimes through a nation state. Because Moors belong to a nation state still. Now, Hoover turned the FBI into an effective anti-communist propaganda tool. The Bureau trained its field against agents to cultivate a nationwide anti-communist consensus by working with local media groups. It leaked intelligence estimates to anti-communist allies like HUAC, the House Un-American Activity Committee, and established liaisons with Hollywood studios. As is well known, the Bureau abetted the rise of McCarthyism and the reign of domestic political repression that it represented. Hoover fully supported Senator Joe McCarthy, notorious for his use of smears and innuendo against suspected subversives. Indeed, many names and allegations derived directly from the FBI files. In the view of FBI agent Robert Lamprey, McCarthy harmed the counterintelligence effort against the Soviet threat because of the reversion it caused. Yet he observed all along, however, was helping him. Hoover also sought to cultivate and influence the White House, seeking to integrate himself and the Bureau with the president by supplying him with information about critics of the administration beyond providing intelligence. In fact, Hoover sought to smear specific groups and individuals he associated with radicalism, including labor movement activists and Christian leaders advocating for equality and justice for those at the bottom of the social economic scale. Thus, for example, in an effort to forestall a flood of propaganda from leftists and so-called liberal sources, an FBI proposal of February 27, 1946 recommended the publication of educational materials to influence public opinion against labor unions, persons prominent in religious circles, and liberal elements. For more on the FBI efforts to educate the public in this period, see Chapter 8 by Douglas M. Charles, an assistant religion a prominent place in this battle against American radicals. Hoover used a tactic also deployed by other American leaders in the period, including Truman, who helped to create a Cold War civil religion by marshaling religious vocabulary on behalf of the United States on assuming the presidency in 1945. For example, Truman declared, I repeat, I believe honestly, the Almighty God intends us to assume the leadership which He intended us to assume in 1920 and which we refused. And I believe if we do that, our problems will almost solve themselves. In their efforts to align America with religion, both Truman and Hoover cultivated a working alliance with the Roman Catholic Church that included benefiting from its intelligent networks. Truman openly moved toward the Vatican, the post war locus of ideological opposition to communism in Western Europe, when he instructed Marilyn C. Taylor, former Roosevelt's wartime representative to Pius the 12th, to return to Rome as his personal representative on April 20th, 1946. In the same year, Hoover and Cardinal Francis Spellman, a friend of Pius XII, co-authored a pamphlet that warned of the dangers of communism. Subsequently, in 1947, Truman and Pius XII effected a highly publicized letter exchange that implicitly indi- indicted the Soviet Union as evil and insisted that a lasting peace could be built only on Christian principles, which is a lie, which is all propaganda, which is all a fraud, which is all a sham, which is all bamboozle. The latter exchange can be seen as a spiritual counterpart to the country's political and economic efforts to counter communism, the Truman Doctrine in March 1947, and the Marshall Plan in June 1947. Truman was particularly anxious at this time about um, isolation, isolationist settlements in Congress and public opinion. A State Department survey had concluded that 2 years after American GIs embraced Red Army troops on the banks of Elbe, 70% of Americans opposed a hardline anti-Soviet policy. Hoover activities on the home front, Albert presented by some scholars as a challenge to the president, can also be seen as an extension of the same policy to the extent that it emphasized communism as an internal domestic threat. Shortly, and communism is all propaganda. Shortly after the emancipation and enunciation of the Truman Doctrine, Hoover delivered an address to Congress that highlighted communism, insidious and conspiratorial nature, depicting it as psychic and spiritual disease that destroys from within. You see all this propaganda, that's all rhetoric, all rhetoric. In the same week in June that George Marshall proposed what became the European Recovery Program, however, appeared on the cover of an issue of Newsweek that included an article he wrote entitled How to Fight Communism. Another propaganda. The article is relevant to our subject because of the way it links democracy and individualism with Christianity. However, binary representation of reality, his efforts to align democracy with religion on one side against godless communism on the other suggests an ideological worldview that explains everything in terms of conspiracy, right? Because conspiracy is what these people play. But they want to call you a conspiracy artist, and they are the ones who made up conspiracy. So that reduces complex issues to a struggle between good and evil, and that exaggerates the evil to the point of paranoia that prompts a self-righteous on the part of the faithful, and that ultimately rests on a blind faith in line with Truman's rhetoric. In other words, Hoover cast the struggle against communism not just as a conflict between two political or economic systems, but as a battle between religion and anti religion, a framing that, among other profound domestic consequences, endowed the FBI with a mission like quality that gave it a exceeding wide scope. Masters of Deceit. Hoover will develop this position in his 1958 book, Master of Deceits. Masters of Deceit, its arguments demonstrate the rhetorical tactics by which he allied himself with religion. Masters of Deceit was written at the suggestion of Assistant Director William Sullivan and was actually composed by bureau agents, though it fully reflected Hoover's sentiments and objectives. Told it at Told it as a manual on communism in America and how to fight it. The book with Hoover's imprimatur was a bestseller, 250,000 copies in hardcover and 2 million paperback. It was also required reading in many schools, written in an authoritative, scholarly tone, lightened by anecdotes, master of deceit, reinforced Hoover's reputation as a leading expert on communism and had a major impact on how it was perceived by the American public. So the master of deceit is them, and he's giving you a book on all lies and propaganda that he want to have indoctrinate the people, okay, to that ideology so they can see the same views as him and help him, you know what I mean, with this fucking hate sentiment. Following Francis Hart, one can see that Masters of Deceit adopts the Roman Catholic Church practice of um curating Marxist positions in order to criticize them more easily. The book is certainly marked by strong religious themes, though by this point, Hoover's references to religion were less explicitly centered on Christianity and more exclusive on other faiths, reflecting a broader shift in the religious discourse of America's political elite during the Cold War era. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who became president in 1953, also allied America with religion, but his conception of religion was more real, real, realistic and inclusive, making room for Jews, for example. As he put it in 1955, recognition of the supreme being is the first, the most basic expression of Americanism. See, that's why the Jews own, so-called Jews own everything in the corporation now. These people got together and worked together against the Aboriginal indigenous people, the Moors. They wear your feathers in secret. They keep you down in secret. They use their tactics. They alphabet soup boys to keep you depressed, okay, and stressed and incarcerated. Recognition of the supreme being. So this is what they're saying. The supreme being is us, but not them. But they want to take your role. They want to be you so bad. Now, God, there could be no American form of government nor an American way of life. The vagueness of Eisenhower's religiously disturbed some Christians leaders who by now recognize the political motives at play, and Christianity remains central to the anti-communist of many Americans, as when the National Council of Churches established in 1950 to confront communism, materialism, and circularism embraced the slogan, the building of a Christian America and a Christian world. But this kind of Christian missionizing language was unacceptable in a Cold War context for the allegiance of the world's peoples, many of whom would perceive it as Western imperialism. In Masters of Deceit, Hoover seems to have taken his lead from the administration, referring, like Eisenhower, to a more generic supreme being rather than God or Christ, and explicitly expanding his critique beyond Christianity by including a chapter titled The Communist Attack on Judaism. For more on Hoover and the Jews, see Sarah's Admoff contribution to his volume, chapter 7. Master of the Deceit asserts key religious Cold War themes, in particular that communism was a false religion, that it was intent on world domination and the eradication of all religion, and that maxims and Christianity were incompatible. These themes come through especially clearly in a chapter titled Communism, a False Religion, in which Hoover develops the contrast between Soviet false religion and ersatz and duplications and imitations of religions qualities, and the authentic rigorously of America. In the America, the individual was endowed with dignity and worth, but to the Soviets the individual was simply a pawn of the state. The Soviets treated the needy with calculated ruthlessness, unlike the United States, where belief in mutual responsibility of our obligation to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and care for the less fortunate prevailed. Where, however, celebrated America's resistance to communist objects, even as he emphasizes America's commitment to the idea that love is the greatest force on the earth. The convention forbids our accepting the communist division of mankind, that by arbitrary standards singles out those fit only for liquidation. So, mankind, he's talking about themselves. They are mankind and they want to keep things in mankind hands. They don't want to give nothing back to man. So they use all type of propaganda, use religion that we gave them to virtuously um prosecute us. You know what I'm saying? And imprison us and use propaganda and all type of tactics to keep Moors and keep Moors with the boot on their back. You see what I'm saying? This is what these people been doing. Now, Now, as he emphasized America's commitment to the idea that love is the greatest force on earth, the convention forbids our accepting the communist division of mankind that, by arbitrary standards, singles out those fit only for liquidation. In Hoover's view, far too many churchmen were far too sympathetic to causes that had communist support, and he was keen to impress on the American people the incompatibility between religion and communism. Another important tenet of the religious Cold War, Hoover proclaimed that no Marxist could adhere to religion, either Christianity or Judaism, because the other elimination of all religion was communism. See, final goal. Now, how that's is communism. You are going against the religious protections of the Constitution institutions and bringing forth war for people's right for their religion. That's treason. That is treason. And we allowed these people to keep doing this. Now, when our Moors gonna stand up? When the regular people gonna stand up and stop this coherented crap? Hmm? So So religion, either Christianity or Judaism, because the utter elimination of all religion was communist final goal. Americans had to remain vigilant in defense of faith and nation. Hoover argued because communism recognized religion as its most potent foe and believed that it must first sap religion's spiritual strength and then destroy it. Published in 1958, Masters of Deceit illustrates how important the idea of the goddess Soviet Bagi was to Eisenhower administration in its effort to build an anti-communist consensus at home and abroad. Eisenhower, elected president by an American populace in a thrios of a religious resurgency, developed the religious interpretation of American destiny that Truman had initiated, rather than simply aligning the state with organized religion, political rhetoric in this era identified the nation as a kind of religion in its own right, identifying faith with proper patriotic commitment. Hoover internalized this conception of patriotism, repeating it in the Masters of Deceit. No hesitant and different have apologetic acts on our own part can suffice. Out of the deep roots of religion flows something warm and good, and a formation of love and justice. Here is the source of strength for our land. See, you don't have no land. It's not your land. You're a foreigner here. Okay, because it's all ideology. Now, if we are to remain free, see, if we are to remain free, see, they are terrified of being put back into slavery. But the prophet came and told us that we're going to rule in love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice. We're not going to do that. But you got these paranoid people. And that's what they think. They paranoid. It is ours to defend and to nourish. For Hoover, what mandated the struggle against communism and by extension, what justified the role of the FBI as a part of that flight was the need to defend the core values that were the source of America and of the religion, freedom, and faith. Now, Hoover and churches. And the churches. The onset of the Cold War was accompanied by a "you are either with us or against us" attitude, by the insistence that a position be taken for or against communism. The present presented a dilemma for economically minded American churchmen committed to the World Council of Churches, which not only sought the participation of churches under communist rule, but had also put peace and colonialism on its agenda. The FBI targeted key ecumenists, more notably Bishop G. Bromley Oxnam, in the early Cold War period. Oxnam was one of the Methodist Church most powerful bishops, a force first in the Federal Council of Churches and then in the subsequently formed National Council of Churches, and a massive presence in the liberal Protestant establishment. Attacking him was an effort to undermine that establishment. The FBI targeting of clergy and denominations that involved themselves in political, economic, and social matters also contributed to divisions among the churches, with war and racism proving particularly polarizing. While the Cold War environment promoted by the FBI weakened and divided the mainstream liberal churches, it also facilitated the rise of the Christian right. Conservative evangelicals were able to move from a tangential to a more central cultural position, owing to emergence of a new patriotic evangelicalism and the way in which religious Cold War discourse intensified strands of pre-millennialism Although it was not Hoover's intent, his Manchurian rhetoric fostered a worldview that allowed for evangelical perspectives to merge into the civil discourse of American politics. Despite the considerable disparities between different groupings of evangelicals, the religious code war allowed evangelicals of all stripes to develop a closer relational identity with the rest of the United States than had previously been the case, which helped them assimilate into mainstream culture and facilitate their participation in the political system. Radicals of the Christian right were not, however, embraced by the FBI in the Eisenhower years. However, sent intelligence reports on the Christian right along with other organizations that were critical of the administration, another example of the extent which FBI surveillance was responsive to White House requesting an interest. Ironically enough, however, he even submitted a report on Christian fundamentalist pundit Carl McEntry, whose views in many ways mirrored those of the FBI director when it came to liberalism in these churches. McEntry was the founder of the International Council of Christian Churches, set up as a counter to the liberal World Council of Churches, and later a supporter of pro Vietnam War demonstrations. But he too was a subject of FBI scrutiny. While particular right wing Christian leaders and organizations were the object of FBI suspicion, however, Hoover's promulgation of evangelical patriotism was one factor that led to the rise of the religious right in the 1970s and early 1980s. During the Eisenhower era, the FBI refined and extended its earlier efforts to influence official policy and public opinion. The outcome was Cominfo, communist infiltration, the code name for a broad program to collect information on dissident activities that was undertaken, even though these years also witnessed decline of communist influence and membership, which were never a significant force in American life to begin with, because it was all propaganda. However, despite the furor that followed McCarthy's attack on American Protestant churches, was determined that the American public remain vigilant against communist infiltration of their churches. Liberal churchmen had been subject to suspicion and smears prior to the Cold War, but come the field marked a new era of particularly zealous, which hunted within churches. The House Committee on Un-American Activities, a recipient of FBI intelligence, led the way, publishing the pamphlet "100 Things You Should Know About Communism and Religion." A canopy of charges against churchmen also emerged from informers from within the Communist Party, USA, CPUSA, the largest communist party in America. The best known was Herbert Philbrick, an undercover agent for the FBI for 9 years, first came to public attention as a witness in the Smith Act trial of communist leaders in 1949. Following their successful prosecution, Philbrick joined the circuit of professional communist um, traducers. He wrote a memoir of his underground ventures, which he became a televised series. He also wrote a syndicate column for the New York Herald. From his elevated position in the public domain, he warned, "The communists are after your church." Notably, Philbrick subsequently became involved with the Christian anti-communist crusade headed by Baptist preacher Dr. Fred C. Swartz. FBI files revealed the number of people who believed that they was a communist campaign to subvert American churches. Parishioners throughout the county mailed their suspicions to the Bureau. Some simply sought clarification, but even those queries show the extent to which Hoover's criteria for measuring potential subversives have instilled doubt and suspicion of innocuous and consensuous um, clergymen. Liberals and former New Dealers usually ranked among those who needed to be watched. Hoover set in motion a disturbing trend of Christian spying on other Christians that remained dissembled throughout the Cold War. And the phenomenon was not confined to the Christian right, questioning the credentials of their liberal counterparts. Those within other religious orders, even within the Catholic Church, could also suspect one another, as illustrated by the case of Father Robert F. Drennan, 1920 to 2007, a pacifist Jesuit priest and the first priest elected to Congress. So you got all these people. He's a Jesuit. You know what a Jesuit is? A Mason, a one that's working for a government, the agent. These all these people are all in cahoots together to keep you in a susurratory position. That's what they're all here for. Okay. Dream's FBI file reveals that in 1971, a nun wrote to Hoover, doubting that a real Catholic priest could hold his un-American views, and suggesting that he was an infiltrator planning to harm the church. As it happens, Drain was later subjected to a full FBI investigation when he was being considered for an appointment by the Clinton White House. That investigation showed him to be a man broadly admitted for his integrity, but that reputation had not prevented the FBI from having already amassed a considerable file, something during only as accidentally discovered to his outrage during a congressional tour of FBI headquarters. There, he learned of the file, which he included the letter from the nun accusing him of becoming a communist plant. Lord. Hoover knew from experience that the churchmen could be served severe critics of American policies at home and abroad, which in his eyes made them valid subjects for surveillance. The FBI practice of linking dissent with disloyalty was most obvious with regard to Christian concerns over peace and war, which in this era translated into reservations about U.S. foreign policy and the nuclear arms buildup. Peace activists, especially opponents of nuclear weapons, were identified with the Soviet inspired peace movement, which in the era of McCarthyism automatically implied that the activists were fellow travelers or communist stooges. FBI surveillance itself usually demonstrate that most were not seeking to serve Soviet interests. Nonetheless, as one former FBI agent congently remarked, investigations of hundreds of perfectly harmless people continued on through the years. So nobody did none of this stuff. They was doing this to control the narrative, and if Moors try to liberate themselves, throw your ass in jail. You know, break laws. You know what I mean? But they gotta conspire to make you look guilty. That's through propaganda. Those supporting racial justice and civil rights movement were also perceived by Hoover as trolls of a communist agenda. Soviet propaganda, highlighted it by the abstinence treatment according to Moorish Americans, which was particularly damage to America's image in the developing world, and those who fought for equal rights within the United States were linked to the communist effort to discredit the country. Martin Luther King Jr. Southern Christian Leadership Conference deliberately inserted Christians into its name to deflect charges of subversion, but to no avail. Christian dissent was considered even worse than secular dissent because, as Hoover put it in Masters of Deceit, every communist success in infiltrating, subverting, and bending religion to the party's aims made the comrades diabolically happy. See, because you came up under their, you already a war. Now you up under their religion, so now they can do whatever they want to do to you. In line with his understanding of religion as the polar opposite of communism, Hoover believed that a dedicated clergyman, being a man of God, is a mortal enemy of communism. Whenever the intentions, however, such a person could nonetheless inadvertently lend prestige and support to the communist cause by as simple as an act as signing a petition for a seemingly worthy cause. However, acknowledged a difference between those who knowingly supported the communists and those who did so unwittingly. Despite acknowledging the sincerity of the latter, Hoover derogated them as dupes and made it clear that while they might have no disloyal inclinations, they were as useful to the communists as the more willing variety of fellow traveler, if not more so. Hoover found within the Senate a receptive audience for his suspicious of dissident clergy, supplying senators with information that included a list of Christian ministers What these clergy had in common was that all were campaigners in areas that FBI regarded as subversive and were linked to groups identified by the FBI as communist fronts. Named and subsequently imprisoned was by Reverend Dr. Woodard Euphus as Methodist lay preacher, a pacifist opposed to the Quran. Opposed to the Korean War, and a civil rights activist who not only supported precisely the sort of radical causes identified with Communist Front activities, but compounded his sins by visiting Moscow and attending the 1950 World Peace Conference in Warsaw. In 1953, Benjamin Gitlow, a former CPUSA helmsman who by 1939 had turned against the party, identified Euphos as one of the principal individuals involved in the communist conspiracy. He charged Euphos uh, categorically rejected. Gitlow subsequently became involved with the evangelical leader Billy James Hargis, known for founding a variety of Christian anti-communist organizations before a sex scandal forced him to resign from his role as president of American Christian College. Euphos faced an intermediate period in prison, which he knew at age 69 could well become a life sentence because he refused to name names to the New Hampshire Attorney General who had been empowered by the state legislature to investigate whether there were any subversive persons within the state. In 1955, the Attorney General Lois Wyman demanded that Euphis reveal those who, in 1954 and 1955, had visited the interfaith, interracial world fellowship center, of which Euphis was executive director, but he refused to disclose this information. The investigation found no evidence of wrongdoing on the part of Euphis, who had fully cooperated with every other aspect of it. But the open ended sentence was nonetheless upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in June 1959. Albert, with four justices dissenting, despite the widespread protest sparked by the case, Euphis was jailed for 1 year. Another Christian leader subject to FBI surveillance was British born Harry F. Ward, an influential Methodist leader, professor of Christian ethics at the prestigious Union Theology Seminary choir of the American Civil Liberties Union for 2 decades, and a prolific writer and speaker, active during both of the United States' two post-war Red Scares. Ward was subjected to FBI surveillance from the First World War through the Vietnam War. He was a radical social gospeler, and all the evidence shows that his activities derived from his Christian convictions. From the perspective of the FBI, however, his causes and associations defense of the Soviet Union, peace activism in pursuit of civil liberties and radical equity, equality, even his foreign birth, all placed him firmly in the security risk category. As early as 1922, Ward drew the eerie of William J. Burns, director of the Justice Department Bureau of Investigation's forerunner of the FBI, who indicted him as an alien who, like so many of them, while our guest reveals our sanctuary, pollutes the temple and spreads from very sanctum itself the seeds of discord, envy, and strife. It seems to have been Ward's denunciation of the Justice Department in 1924 as functioning to destroy civil liberty that brought him to the attention of Hoover shortly before Hoover assumed the directorship uh-huh, after Burns' departure. Ward persistently criticized what he regarded as the damage done to America by political repression. And in his artery during the 1950s, he identified four cornerstones at at the base of the police state that had emerged during the Cold War: the FBI list, HUAC's Inquisition, the U.S. Attorney's General list of subversive organizations as a test of employee loyalty, and paid informers. Criticism that did nothing to endear him to the government. Indeed, for years, one of his sons was unable to secure government employment and was told quite um, cate- categorically it was because of his father's activity. Nonetheless, despite smears, surveillance, HUAC hearings, and marginalization within his church, Ward was never deterred from his quest for social justice, and the FBI finally assertment of Ward when it deactivated his file 2 years before his death in December 1966 revealed that even from his perspective, he was never much of a threat. Subject file has been reviewed at the Bureau. He is a modern European male, 90 years of age, who is a retired minister. He studied in Russia between 1924 and 1932 and was reportedly a Communist Party member between 1943 and 1945. Since 1945, has he has supported various Communist Party front organizations, even added anti-communists who supported the Cold War consensus yeah, indicted the Soviet Union and were declared patriots could find themselves subject to FBI scrutiny if they happened to have an association with what the FBI deemed radicalism. As a young man, the Methodist Bishop G. Bromley Oxnam had been committed to social justice and civil liberties and was also mentored by and defended Harry Ward. Between 1920 and 1924, Special Agent A. Hopkins wrongly smeared Oxnam as a radical activist and advocate of the Soviet system, a charge that became the foundation of DOSA that would grow to more than 400 pages. Not only was Oxnam unaware of the file of the surveillance to which he was subjected, but to the day of his death, he praised the Bureau and its leader, J. Edgar Hoover. See there? These people ain't nothing. They ain't nothing. In the end, however, indeed, Oxnam even wrote an article published in June 1953, How to Uncover Communists, in which he endorsed the FBI, its, you know, its through work, its loyalty to American tradition, and its spiritual leader, J. Edgar Hoover. When at his own request he appeared before HUAC, less than a month later, he in effect named names. In the end, however, it did not matter that Osnum criticized Stalin and the Soviet regime, or that he was a committed Cold War warrior and anti-communist to the core. Indeed, he was friendly with John Foster Dulles and Dulles, the famous anti-communist Secretary of State. The HUAC was predisposed to see any supporter of liberal causes as a communist sympathizer and accordingly attacked the bishop. For his part, Hoover denied Oxnam's request to meet him and declined Oxnam's invitations to address the Methodist General Conference. And its bishops or groups through the director was always cardinal cordial to Oxnam, who had the strength of the Methodist Church behind him, as well as the support of Secretary Dulles. However, was careful in his dealings with the churches to justify FBI activities as intended for their benefit. His strategy consisted of claiming that American communists were plotting to subvert the churches and turn them into allies of the very people who sought the church's destruction. FBI surveillance was therefore presented as a means of protecting churches from communists. Uh-huh. Just like Matt Dillon, right? Infiltration and preventing churchmen from supporting causes that would ultimately prove detrimental to country and church. Christian criticism of the status quo of dissent from the Cold War consensus was attributed to external communist influence. However, um, tenuous that accusations and regardless of whatever concerns might really have prompted the dissent. Master of Deceit warned that communists sought to exploit the churches and to neutralize religion as an effective counterweapon by appearing to align themselves with religion, while the CPUSA made sure to avoid appearing anti-religious, according to Hoover. See, all Hoover did was take his precepts of his perception and make them into a propaganda You know what I mean? So he can say that he's protecting the country. He's not protecting the country. All he's doing is suppressing and um breaking the constitutional laws and provisions that these people have treaties up under. Now, according to Hoover, when it was tactfully expedient, CPUSA members even likened themselves to early Christian martyrs, suffering persecution for attempting to do humankind. However, insisted that the CPUSA focus on peace, democracy, and of course civil rights was a ruse part of a communist strategy to weaken and then eventually destroy America by attacking the source of its strength, its faith. Hoover derived the way in which the anti-religious Communist Party is now to be found in close united front cooperation with dozens of churches and other religious organizations on questions of intermediate economic and political interest to the toiling masses. For Hoover, Christian preoccupation with inequality and poverty offered communists an ideal opportunity to critique the American way of life and promote the ideological alternative. As Hoover explained, the church's legitimate interest in better housing and the elimination of social injustice allowed communists to exploit, intimidate economic and political problems. So why y'all as the government did not do anything to combat those things to stop this communist inclusion because you niggas were the goddamn communists. You niggas made all this stuff up. Y'all are the main masters of the seat. Hoover asserted that the communist movement was reaching out of the churches, an open fellowship encouraging members to infiltrate religious organizations in order to recruit them for the communist cause. He explained that comrades who infiltrated church circles would find respectability and a wider audience for their views, presenting themselves as having their roots in Christianity rather than communism, facilitate the implementation of Marxist Leninist thought among idealists, particularly the young. Hoover explained that churches offered communists a means of identifying their programs intended to promote Soviet interests with genuine, rigorously values such as peace, brotherhood, and justice. The churches, however, inadvertently provide conduits by which communists could most effectively exploit the natural yearning for peace. Every possible deceptive device is being used to link the party's peace program with the church. Indeed, Hoover claimed that Communist Party members were advised to join small churches so that one can more easily himself into a position of leadership. While he cast his efforts as a defense of religion, Hoover was in fact seeking to undermine the church's authority and influence in areas of potential conflict with the administration. He accused communism of cynically exploiting religion, using it to legitimize the communist agenda while seeking to undermine religion from within. The irony is that Hoover FBI was deploying some of the very tactics that they identified with the communist enemy because they was doing the same thing. That's it. It was all a ruse. It was all a facade to hide the main agenda. Okay? Some of the very tactics that he identified with the communism, the FBI aligned itself with religion to legitimize its agenda and, in the process, soothe the division and distrust among the religions that Hoover claimed the communists wanted. Right? So, I'm going to stop right there, Morris. And the next breakdown is going to be the breakdown on of the consensus. Okay? All right? So that will be the next breakdown, Morris. So I just want y'all to understand what has been, you know, permeated on the Moors and on their psyche. And we have all these debates with these Moors that's supposed to be supreme grand sheiks and leaders, but they're not leaders. They are leaders to our demise, and they are naturalizing Moors within the United States corporation of Ingas Legis, and they are furthering putting Moors into slavery. Now, that's not a good look. That's why a lot of Moors that's from Kenland Moors, Taj Tariq Bey, um, Asir the Duke of Tears, Cujo Ottawa L, those Moors, Hakeem Bey, those Moors have been putting in this work for years, Moors. All I'm doing is, reaching in and grabbing my work so I can contribute to this upliftment of fallen humanity because our people are in an outrageous mental state that there needs to be corrected, and our principles and our nationality need to be respected because this is the land of the free and the home of the brave. And I will leave you with that, Moors. Islam, I am Menelik, Allah, Ar Rahim, El Bay. Islam is a Moors. Peace, love, and light.